During the peak of Michael Phelps's career, he was sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night, plus an additional nap during the day. Sleep was an integral part of his routine and recovery. Unfortunately, this isn't the case for all athletes. According to the NCAA, over half of college athletes report getting insufficient sleep. There are many things that make it hard for athletes to get proper sleep. Early morning practices, travel schedules, late night workouts, and anticipation of events can make it difficult to get the recommended 8 hours. So what can athletes do to get the most out of this vital human function? I talked with Dr. Michael Graner to find out. Dr. Graner is a licensed clinical psychologist and is the director of sleep and health research at the University of Arizona. He served on both the Mental Health Task Force and Inter-Association Task Force for Sleep and Wellness for the NCAA, the Mental Health Consensus Committee for the International Olympic Committee, and works to help improve sleep and performance in professional and non-professional athletes. In this episode, we go deep into the sleep needs of athletes, what role sleep plays in performance and recovery, how athletes can manage sleep during the difficult training and competition schedules, the tools and protocols for getting a great night's sleep every night, the role of dreams, and how sleep is related to mental health. All right, Dr. Graner, welcome to the Exponential Athlete Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me on here.
Of course, I'm really grateful for you for coming on. You're obviously one of the leaders in overall sleep health, sleep mental health, and insomnia, and a bunch of these different areas. But something that was really appealing is you've done a lot of work in sports as well.
Yeah.
And as we talked about before the show, I think sports is maybe an aspirational thing for a lot of people. Is you'd expect these athletes to be doing things well. You'd expect them to be really maximizing what they're doing. And by studying them, by studying their patterns, maybe we can also find some things that would be beneficial to the general
At the end of the day, athletes are just people. They're just people trying to do the best they can at what they're doing. And aren't we all?
I agree 100%. Well, again, I can't say enough good things about your pedigree. For the listeners, I think it'd be really useful to start with just a broad understanding of, hey, for athletes, what is useful to know about sleep? What purpose does it serve?
Great question. So it's really important to recognize what sleep is. Sleep is a set of states that your body gets into in a predictable way about every 24 hours that involve reduced consciousness, perceptual disengagement, and lack of physical movement. But as much of a definition as that is, that's not really a useful one because we all know that, right? But what is sleep? Sleep is the opportunity for your body to do all of the things and maintenance and organization and all the stuff that is inefficient for it to do while you're engaging with the environment during the day. Evolution figured out a long time ago, it's much easier to change the oil in your car when you're not still driving it. There's so many things in the body that require maintenance and organization and recovery and replenishment and repair and all these things that are just way more efficient to do when you're disengaged with the environment. And that's really what sleep is about. It's about performing all of those functions that it's less able to do during the day. And so it's more efficient to just do it at a time when you're disengaged from the environment.
So in terms of those systems that are in play, the sleep demands that are needed, does that change throughout someone's life, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. When people are younger, they probably need a lot more sleep because they're doing a lot more growing. It's like growth hormone is pretty much only secreted during stage N3 sleep. So there's a bunch of different sleep stages. We can talk about those later if you want, or people could just Google it. But things like growth hormone, things like recovery, repair, brain development, a lot of this stuff happens during sleep because you're disengaged from the environment and you're processing things. So it's like infants will have emotion on their faces during sleep before they will experience those emotions when they're awake. There's all kinds of sleep is amazing. And there's all these things that happen, whether it's in the brain, whether it's in the body, in the immune system. And so needs change. When you're growing, you might need more sleep. When you're recovering, you might need more sleep. As people get older and their bodies are less able to grow and recover, even if we wanted them to, is it that we need less sleep? The jury's out on that. It still seems that even older adults who are getting at least about 7 hours tend to live longer and be healthier, but they do seem to be a little more resilient against sleep loss. But for most people who are in their late teens, early 20s into their 30s, they still need sleep to be able to function and recover.
And that's usually maybe like the peak performance ages of being an athlete. So it's probably important to get that type of fuel and that type of, like nourishment for your body at that period of time. Are there different things, and you alluded to this a little bit, like what are the different things that maybe account for how much sleep you need? So you mentioned recovery. Is there like a physical exertion? If I'm working out very hard in the day, is that something that could provide more need for sleep?
Not so much from an energy perspective, but a little more from a recovery perspective. So for example, if you're training during the day, what is training? Training is essentially putting your body through a stressful experience so that it can grow back stronger and develop that muscle memory of how to move and all those things, right? Where do you think that occurs? That doesn't happen when you're awake. The muscle memory happens when you're asleep. That's when the memory gets created. The recovery, the stressing out the muscles during the day, and then they grow back stronger. When does the growing back happen? All this stuff is happening during sleep. So training rigorously without sleeping is mostly just injuring yourself on purpose, as opposed to actually getting much better. I mean, you will have some recovery, but it won't be optimized.
So a lot of what we're doing during the day is maybe learning, and then during sleep we're encoding, making it
kind of where it might. I would say most of what we're doing during the day is experiencing, and then at night what we're doing is we're integrating that experience into our body, into our mind. So like into our body, it's like if we're engaging vigorously with the world, it's during sleep where our body's like, okay, we have to better prepare our body for that sort of experience again. And then so we embody our experience in our sleep, and that becomes part of our psychology and our memory and our emotions, and all of that happens during sleep too.
Well, so all of that happens during sleep, and then we see the repercussions of the positive or negative the next day, right?
Right.
So what are some of the systems that a good night's sleep or a bad night's sleep can impact, whether it's memory, whether it's physical, whether it's visual, whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the most obvious ones is focus and attention. Sometimes in even subtle ways, but our ability to maintain focus and attention is one of the first things to go, even if we don't even notice it's happening. Which does happen. You have people, the more sleep deprived you are, the less impaired you think you are in terms of ability to focus and pay attention. Memory also plays an important role. Memory and emotion, a lot of people don't realize that memory and emotion in the brain are two sides of actually the same coin. They're physically, the main centers in the brain that control memory and emotion regulation are literally attached to each other. And an emotion very much is a filter for memory. And it helps us integrate memories. So emotion regulation and memory processing are highly dependent on sleep. Decision making, strategic decision making is another one in the brain.
So is that related to like impulsivity, for example?
Impulsivity. Okay. And so that's sort of an integration of emotion regulation and decision making comes out as impulsivity. Short fuses. Show me someone with a short fuse, I will show you someone who's not sleeping well. In the body, sleep is, there's lots of recovery that happens in the body. Pretty much every hormone system is partially regulated by sleep. The immune system is highly integrated with sleep. Even the memory in the immune system, we talk about how you get exposed to things during the day and then your immune system remembers them to go after them later. That memory seems to be at least partially sleep dependent, just like other forms of memory. The heart, the energy metabolism, so like the pancreas and the insulin and glucose systems are seem to be highly integrated with sleep-wake regulation. Find me a system in the body, I will probably show you how it's connected. And part of the reason is that sleep is so old evolutionarily. I mean, it's been there since the beginning. And because of that, our physiology is built around it. It's not something that we existed and then sleep came to help us. It's that sleep was there before we were. We study sleep in all kinds of organisms. Most people are surprised to learn that most of the genetics of human sleep-wake regulation are first discovered in fruit flies, because their sleep-wake regulation is shockingly similar to ours, because it's a very old system that evolution figured out a long time ago. There's people who study sleep in jellyfish who don't even have brains. So you don't even need a brain to sleep, So like it's a fundamental part of life, it seems.
Well, it's very interesting to think about that. I mean, we think of evolution. I mean, what probably most people would argue makes us human is our prefrontal cortex,
Right.
our logical reasoning. And sleep very clearly precedes that, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see that, hey, that logical reasoning, it's actually built off of these other systems that were, their sleep was this prerequisite.
Right.
So obviously this downstream effect is going to be important.
I mean, find me somebody who had a really bad night of sleep and I'll ask them how their prefrontal cortex is doing. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why when people wake up in the middle of the night and their brain wants to be asleep, but they're awake and their prefrontal cortex is just not online yet. This is where we make bad decisions. This is where we sort of become really emotionally. Anyone who's been awake at 3 o'clock in the morning when they wanted to be asleep knows this. Or anyone who has a really bad night and they wake up in the morning and they know this, that your ability to think and process information is sleep dependent.
Well, and if we take this into the frame of an athlete, so we
Yeah.
talked about emotional regulation.
Yeah.
If you're essentially not able to handle adversity well,
Right.
if you're impulsive with
Stress.
decision making, under stress, any of these things, that's going to negatively
Quick
impact
thinking,
Yeah.
creativity. Like these are all things that are critically important for athletes. On top of things like coordination and strength and speed, which are also sleep. Like I said, find me an outcome. I'll find you how it's related. But things like being able to work under pressure and think clearly under periods of pressure. People to the ability to be able to see into the future and make predictions about what's going to happen and where things are going to be, how you react to things, where you put your attention and how distracted you are. All of these things, yeah.
Well, it's funny you bring up the foresight or being able to see into the future. In one of the previous episodes I did with Zach Shobrun, he talks about how largely sports are not about your physical aspects.
Right.
It's about training your predictive
Your mind
ability.
as well.
Hitting a baseball, your ability to actually react to the baseball, it's very close between people, but your ability to predict and understand based on the input is what's really important. So if you think about that from both the reaction
Right.
as well as your kind of prediction engine,
Right.
might be a little more fine-tuned one of these days when you have better sleep.
Yeah, as a scientist, I find it very fascinating to take these processes and look at how many parts there actually are, where that we just totally take for granted. We don't actually think about it because we don't need to function. It's just when you look at it under a microscope, you actually see there's all these different components, and each one of them are a link in the chain, and each one of them can become a weak link in the chain.
Yeah, it's probably not necessarily the case that you're only as strong as your weakest link.
Right.
But there's a lot of the time where there might be some bottleneck. Right. I mean,
exactly.
Exactly.
In
In sports, usually the physical size is the bottleneck, right? Oh, I'm not tall enough to play in the NBA, but I have all these other skills.
Right.
But there's probably a lot more that are underneath the surface or that are not necessarily recognizable to us that are out there. And probably sleep is one of them.
Right. It's one of those things. It's universal. It's non-negotiable. It's a requirement. And it's been there since the beginning.
So are there any scientific studies, any research that you've personally done where you're seeing, hey, there's a dramatic performance improvement or drop off based on sleep in some athletes here?
Yeah. I've done some of this work and lots of other people have done this work. Some of it's been in athletes specifically. The military has been doing this work for decades because they recognized this a long time ago. You also see this sort of research in other occupational health settings, whether it's commercial truck drivers, in terms of police, in terms of firefighters, in terms of shift workers in factories, long haul pilots. You see, there's been research on sleep and performance across a lot of these different groups. And athletes are another group. Athletes are really a set of occupational groups. Some of them travel more than others. Some of them, it's more about strength, and sometimes it's more about dexterity. Like there's different subgroups within athletes that are just like other kinds of jobs. And essentially what's seen is that on the one hand, people can self-select. Not everyone's going to be an elite athlete based only on their potential, but it's also what they're able to accomplish given the limitations and constraints of their situations. But also what you see is you take otherwise high-performing people, and if you sleep deprive them, they get impaired. Even if they, and the fascinating thing is they become way more impaired, way faster then they realize that by the time they recognize that, you know what, I'm maybe 20-25% impaired, they're probably way more than that at that point. There's one study in particular that I remember that was in younger adults. I think they were in their 20s, and they sleep deprived them. Their estimated level of impairment was 20-25%, but it was really more like 70% or more worse than their baseline was. They just didn't recognize how impaired they were. And the other thing that's seen from all of these studies is the longer you're impaired, the less likely you are to tell the difference between your level of impairment and what you could have been, because it becomes sort of a new normal for you. It's not just that you lose ability to see your impairment. It's that you sort of become used to being impaired, and you think impaired is normal at that point. It's an interesting phenomenon, but you don't kind of stop getting worse. Like you get these cumulative deficits over time, and it's really troubling.
Well, you see that with a lot of athletes. I mean, at least for me, especially in high school and college, where you're getting up early, you're kind of forced to in the school system, whatever it is, or you have early training, early practice, and then you see these guys sleeping for 30 hours on the weekend.
Right,
and you're like, well, maybe that's
right.
Maybe that's
I mean,
not.
So people ask me all the time, and I use this analogy a lot, is how much sleep do I need on the weekend to make up for not sleeping during the week? And because we used phrases like sleep debt that make sleep sound like money. But really, it's not like that. Sleep is a lot like diet nutrition, which is something else that's foundational to our biology and it's been there since the beginning. It's similar in that way. It's foundational in that way. But also similarly, that's like saying, if I eat nothing but crap during the week of cheeseburgers and pizza and that's it, and potato chips, how much salad do I need to eat on the weekend to undo all that damage? And like, that's better, I guess, than just eating cheeseburgers, pizza, and potato chips 7 days a week. But you're not fixing the problem at that point. You're kind of mitigating a little bit. So that's why people who sleep in on weekends live longer than people who at least don't sleep in on weekends if they're sleep deprived. But people who get regular sleep all the time do better.
So backtracking just a little bit,
Yeah.
I had a thought, and I was wondering, are there any reasonable diagnostics people can take regularly to evaluate how impaired they are? So, for example, when I travel a lot, I play chess on my phone.
Yeah.
And when I'm sleep deprived, I suck. I'm so bad. And there's a certain level of chess masters that you can play against a computer where usually I beat them. And then when I'm sleep deprived, I'm like, wow, why can't I beat this person that I usually beat?
So the thing about that is exactly right on is you've got a good baseline to work off of, that you have some objective data about what your normal level of performance in this cognitive task, whatever it happens to be, is. And you can re-administer that task, taking it as a scientific perspective. You can re-administer the task under potentially impaired conditions and evaluate your score. And that aspect of it, I think, is important, because it's not like a blood test where this score means bad universally across people. It's more about relative to performance, especially with athletes, because athletes are often exceptions to all kinds of rules. They're outliers in all kinds of ways. So what if to them an impairment means better than 90% of the population, but it's still impairment? I remember working with, there was a swimmer who was preparing for Olympic trials, and they were still outperforming everyone in the pool at the time of where they were competing, but they knew that they might not be good enough for the next couple levels up. And they're like, something's slowing me down, but I can't tell what it is. Actually, what they asked me, they asked the sports psychologist. The sports psychologist came to me and said, I can't find anything. What's going on? I'm like, well, let's take a look at their sleep at night. And it turns out that there was an undiagnosed sleep issue. And so that's the other thing is sleep disorders are highly underdiagnosed. And so if you have undiagnosed mild to moderate sleep apnea, which a lot of athletes have and don't even think about it because they think of sleep apnea as a thing in older, overweight men or whatever. But I've diagnosed sleep apnea in, teenage, adolescent, perfectly fit athletes. It's just something in their airway biology. And that was what was making their oxygen utilization and their sleep shallow artificially at night, making them more fatigued during the day. Even though they were performing great on paper, they knew that they could be doing better and something was holding them back and they could figure out what it was. So what I would say is, get a value. So there's a great resource online. It's free. It's called sleephealthscreen.com. It's just a questionnaire you can fill out. Anyone can fill it out. And it doesn't tell you if you have a sleep disorder, but it tells you, like, do you have any important red flags? And if you do, get evaluated. It doesn't hurt. There's no blood that gets drawn. It's fine. But at least you know. So that's one thing I would say is look for. I mean, I've diagnosed narcolepsy in pro athletes who had no idea they had narcolepsy. They just knew they were tired all the time. And then it changed their performance when they actually got treated. So it happens. And so part of it might be sleep health habits, but part of it might actually be maybe everything you're doing isn't working because you've got a boulder in the way that you didn't even know was there.
Well, that to me is one of the most important things athletes can do, is kind of track their data, evaluate things. And if there's an anomaly or something is, like, I'm putting all this work and I'm not getting returns, there might be something that is viable and movable,
right?
That you can do. I mean,
sleep is more modifiable than people realize.
Interesting. 100%. And that's so something I really like that Michael Phelps did and his coaches did. Actually, just swimmers in general, right? Is they track their lactate data when they swim all the time. And that means that something like a sleep, that is adjustable, can be changed, and you can see the results and the validation. And maybe that's because in some sense you're more of a scientist than I am, but I still consider myself a scientist. But that seems so logical to us, but also it seems very difficult when you're just trying to maximize your performance. And maybe that's a role.
Yeah. As a researcher, sometimes the hardest questions are, what are the variables that you look at? What are the things that are potentially modifiable, and where are the associations going to be? So choosing the right outcome variable and choosing the right predictor variable are sometimes very much a challenge. So, if you look and you don't see something, maybe you weren't looking in the right spot. But yeah, I think tracking data. So objective data, there's something really important. I want to draw a distinction between subjective and objective sleep data. And this is something that confuses a lot of people. Which one is better? The answer is it depends. Objective data are really useful, like from tracking data or from an in-lab sleep study. Those are really useful for being able to track aspects of sleep that you don't necessarily experience. They're good for sleep stages, even though the sleep staging data from trackers is more ballpark than accurate, but it's ballpark. It's not nothing. It's potentially useful. But also the sleep wake data that'll capture awakenings you don't remember. It'll capture aspects of your sleep you weren't necessarily conscious of, which is super helpful. However, it's not a direct measure of your sleep biology. We actually have no direct measure of sleep biology. All we have are indirect measures. And what that means is none of them are going to perfectly agree with each other because none of them is perfectly correct. And some of them are more correct in certain ways. So for example, tracking data, like sleep tracker data, if it's a good tracker, not all trackers are the same. And I could talk about that if you want to. They're generally really good at being able to tell whether or not you're probably asleep on a minute-to-minute basis. That's what they're best at. Your recollection of the night is not really good at that. It's going to miss a lot of brief awakenings during the night. You don't remember an awakening less than 2 or 3 minutes anyway, and you have a bunch of them, which is why you'll see these little awakenings on your tracker data. If the tracker is good, it'll find them. But do they matter? That's another question. But what a tracker can't measure are things like insomnia. Because insomnia is about the struggle to sleep, the sleep disturbance. You can actually have tracker data that looks completely normal with 7 to 8 hours of sleep, falling asleep in 15 minutes, awake less time during the night. And then the person can say, oh, I only got 3 or 4 hours of sleep. It was miserable. I had terrible insomnia. Who was correct? Well, maybe they were physically asleep, but parts of their brain were still awake. They were still experiencing the passage of time. They were still mentally computing things. So in their mind, they might have still been partially awake. So we call it paradoxical insomnia because it's kind of we don't know which one's right. Were they awake or were they asleep? Well, maybe a little of both, or maybe one is wrong. We don't know. And the truth is, we don't have the technology yet to measure some aspects of sleep accurately. So that what that means is anytime you're looking at these objective data, look at them for what they do, but don't look at them for things that they don't do.
Yeah. Well, it also depends who's looking at the data
Right.
for what matters. The subjective
Right.
data, if I feel like I got 3 hours of sleep, even
Right.
though my tracker says that I didn't, that data to me
That's
is
relevant.
yeah, it's
That's relevant. Which
data,
one
yeah.
is correct? Both. You got 3 hours of something and 8 hours of something. And maybe it was you got the sleep to recover your immune system, but you didn't get the sleep to recover your memory and emotion processing or something because your brain was too active, or maybe there was chronic. Because another thing that we don't talk about enough with athletes and sleep, we're always talking about getting enough and whatever, but what we don't talk about is pain. Athletes are like veterans. Like they put their body through a lot over a lot of years. And what I've found is a lot of elite athletes that I talk to, whether they're pro athletes or Olympic athletes, a lot of them talk about baseline pain levels that they sort of ignore. That, like, does pain get in your way of sleep? Nah. How much pain do you, what on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the highest pain level you get in a typical week of just pain? And they're like probably 6 or 7 sometimes. And like, what's your baseline level of pain? Like, I don't know, 3 or 4. I'm like, that's high. And when you're laying in bed, that can make sleep shallow. So that's another issue too, is that we sort of put these things in the background of our experience that could also be relevant, where the tracker can pick up that shallowness, or your experience can pick up the fact that it wasn't restful, even if the tracker data looks normal. Well, that might have been why it wasn't restful, because your body was doing something else at the time. So it's really about the collection of pieces of information, not focusing on just one of them.
I really like this idea of collection of pieces of information. Yeah. I mean, as a researcher, as a scientist, you're looking at largely big pictures, aggregations of data. But on an athlete to athlete level, we have to look at an N of 1 sample.
Right.
And there's all these different confounding factors, but our human brain can actually be pretty good at looking at the research and being like, oh, in this specific use case,
exactly,
this is what's going to be useful.
And because we don't have one number that captures everything of what sleep is, it doesn't exist. As much as, they might be spitting out a sleep score, but it's a mostly made up number. It's meant to be helpful. If it's helpful, it is. If it's not, it's not. But we don't have one. It's like nutrition. Are you getting enough calories? If you're not, then you need to be getting more because you got an energy utilization issue. But just because you're getting enough calories doesn't mean you're getting good nutrition. Are you getting enough protein? Are you getting enough of all the types of protein? Are you getting enough carbs? Are you getting enough of the vitamins and the minerals and the other nutrients you need? Are you getting the right balance? All of those. There's no one number that says nutrition is your diet is good versus your diet is bad.
Yeah, we need the baseline, right, of the human. And if I have a condition where I can't eat some form of animal protein, then
what are you going to do? Just like burst into flames like my life is over? Like, no, you find workarounds and ways around it and ways to make up for that.
And, I think that at a big picture, as athletes are looking at this conversation, it'll probably seem confusing. Like, oh, I have all these things that I can do. But at the beginning stage, it's just tracking what you're doing, understanding, hey, these are protocols that could help me. These are some different areas where obviously sleep is important. How do I get the most out of what I got? And
so the way I would look at it is like, if you wanted to take the pulse of your sleep, you'd say like, okay, first look at duration. Am I getting at least probably about 7 hours? By recollection, not based on the tracker. The tracker data may underestimate your self-report by 30 to 60 minutes. That's fine. Tracker data is not what the recommendations are based on. It's based on your self-report because that picks up those other things. So if your self-report of the night feels like you were getting at least 7 hours, you're probably getting enough. You may be getting enough if it's less, it's just less likely. Okay, you've got duration. The next thing you look at is in terms of timing. Are you able to get sleep during your biological night? Now we can talk about napping, about getting sleep outside of the biological night. Because people have different biological nights. Like younger people, their biological night starts and ends later. So if you're 18 and you're looking at the clock and the clock says midnight, your brain's saying like, oh, it's only 9 p.m. Why are you trying to go to bed yet? Whereas a 70-year-old looks at the clock says midnight. Their brain's like, oh my gosh, it's 3 a.m. Why are you still awake? So like where the biological night is can be different for a morning person versus a night person and changes across the lifespan. But you should be getting most of your sleep, the vast majority of it in your biological night for optimal functioning. That's the timing. The regularity. There's increasing data showing that because sleep performs so many functions in the body, the predictability of your sleep pattern is used by a lot of these different functions to be able to coordinate each other. And when your sleep window becomes a moving target and unpredictable, it makes those recovery and other functions less efficient, which is why irregular sleep, which could be weekday fluctuations, but it could also just be just general irregularity, predicts things like heart disease and diabetes and weight gain and more and shorter lifespan and all these things, because all those functions are it's, you know, the sports analogy is if the field keeps changing location and changing size, and sometimes it's short and sometimes it's long, and then sometimes it's narrow and sometimes it's wide, like it's hard to play a good game because it's everything's always a moving target and it's hard to plan. It's hard to have plays if the field keeps changing shape and size. So regularity in sleep is also important. Another dimension is efficiency. So if most of the time you're in bed is actually spent to sleep, if most of the time in your sleep opportunity is mostly spent to sleep, you're probably doing okay. So a good rule of thumb is 85, 90%. Which means if you're spending 8 hours in bed, at least 480 minutes is 8 hours. If about 400 So if at least like 400 of those minutes is spent to sleep, or 430 of those are spent to sleep, you're probably fine. But if you're spending a lot of time awake in bed, that's a sign of insomnia, which could make sleep less refreshing. Another dimension to look at is fragmentation, where if you're up and down a lot during the night, it might mean that your body's attending to something like pain or something, or discomfort or something in the environment, or a sleep disorder or something that's in the way of your body getting the sleep it needs. And then the last dimension that's really important for athletes is the focus on daytime alertness, where daytime alertness is sometimes the best marker that something is going on when you are unconscious that you may not be aware of. But if you're having trouble maintaining consciousness, like if when you stop moving, you start nodding off, that's a real sign that something in your sleep isn't right. So think about sleep multidimensionally, like nutrition. Like these are the different dimensions to look at. Take a second to think about where you are with those. And if you want to be optimal, those are all different directions you can take to improve. And if they're all great, then worry about something else.
Something in there that you were describing before, it still really is sticking out to me, is that the injury and the pain levels, that to me is sort of a second order. Sleep is a second order consequence.
Yeah.
And we often don't think about it. It's, for example, I hurt my back recently. I'm playing a lot of golf and that wasn't great for my lower back, but it's really been affecting my sleep. I'm moving around a lot more. I never would have thought that, hey, this back injury is going to detract from my mental performance on the podcast, or my focus during the day, or some of these other things. But me not managing or focusing on that to the best of my ability, it actually does affect the sleep, and it has this cascading effect across
exactly. It's like a feed forward loop, and I love how you put that, where it's like I would have never thought that a back issue will create a consequence on me being able to do this podcast optimally via sleep interruption. And I think that insight is the kind of thing that me as a sleep researcher think about all the time, which is why I structure my sleep the way that I do. But I think that's an insight that I think a lot of people don't make that connection and realize how it's connected with everything.
So what are some things that have maybe the most second order consequences that we don't think about? I would imagine screens are one, but are there other things that are really prevalent, like that pain?
Yeah. So I'll talk about screens in a minute, because I've got some suggestions about screens that are actually workable. Because all the people who say put down your screens an hour before bed clearly hasn't met a human, because they can't do that. So I've got other solutions for that. But that aside, pain is a huge one. Untreated sleep disorders is way bigger than you'd think. If I have someone who comes into my clinic and says, I feel like my sleep just isn't refreshing, and I'm waking up during the night and I don't, or my sleep is kind of shallow and I don't know why. The algorithm in my head is, but the checklist I have in my head is: number 1, pain; number 2, underdiagnosed, especially sleep apnea, but maybe something else. But sleep apnea is just by far the most common and untreated. Like 90% of cases are untreated. according to recent estimates. Third one is something in the environment, whether it's your bed, old mattress, you're sleeping on a mattress topper that doesn't breathe, and so then like your thermal regulation's thrown off. So something environmental, or a bed partner who's snoring or moving around, or you're living on a street and there's outside noises that you don't even hear because they're making your sleep shallow, but they're over by the time you wake up, so you don't know what woke you up. There's all kinds of stuff like that in the environment, or if it's something, or you have some sort of substance, whether that's most substances either pull you down or push you up. And so the problem with the stuff that pulls you down is it creates more daytime fatigue and stuff the next day, and can sometimes make sleep more shallow, even if there's more of it. The things that give you energy, like caffeine or whatever, they have effects even hours after you realize they do. And because of that, they could be interfering with sleep. And so there's all kinds of things, whether it could be caffeine, could be nicotine, but athletes should be smoking anyway. Nicotine's a stimulant, especially people who are smoking at night.
Well, so nicotine's a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Because a lot of athletes use smokeless tobacco. I mean, you think of baseball players constantly dipping. I think that there is some evidence where I don't think any tobacco products are a good idea. I want to be very clear about that. Right. But the nicotine could have some improvement on reaction time.
Right.
Energy.
Cost benefit, it goes in the wrong direction.
Correct.
But you'd be dishonest if you'd saying it's just happening out of random chance that people clearly aren't getting some benefit of it somewhere, but theoretically they should be able to get in a better way. Same thing I feel the same way with cannabis with sleep. It's something that's increasingly used in sport right now. And there is data that shows that it can help with sleep in certain ways. However, from an athlete perspective, there's probably a better solution for whatever it is you're doing. Similarly, so nicotine, a lot of people don't realize that nicotine as a stimulant can interfere with sleep at night. And alcohol is another one where it is a sedative, but it makes your sleep more shallow, especially in the latter part of the night. But then also things like medications, whether it's pain medications, antidepressants, ADHD meds, like a lot of stuff that a lot of athletes are using have impacts on sleep that they might not be thinking about. Even things that they think are helping their sleep might be helping some aspects of their sleep, but might be making other aspects of their sleep less refreshing.
And I would imagine this varies by person as well.
Right? Varies by person. And this also includes supplements, where there's a lot of supplements that people are taking for sleep that either don't work or might be backfiring, or workout supplements. Workout supplements often can often have, besides caffeine, other things in them that could be interfere, especially if you're taking it in the evening. There could be things that could be interfering with sleep. I remember I had one athlete who I worked with where it was actually the workout supplement he was taking at night had the wrong amino acid profile in it that was just keeping him up. We switched that out and he did way better.
And so it was a glutamine.
Yeah.
That is kind of
you want to minimize that at night because it could be stimulating. Glycine, better for nighttime.
Are there any other ones like that where it's like, that most people would be like, yeah, I thought that would net zero or would be good for my sleep, but it's actually
B12. Bad. You also want to avoid that one at night.
That makes sense.
That's another one you want to avoid at night. So what's tough is B vitamins are great, especially for recovery, but not the B12 at night.
Well, it's a very interesting conversation around timing of these things. I've seen some research that vitamin C before a workout is actually quite negative for endurance and things along those lines. And just like vitamin B12 is good for you, right? You need it, but at a certain time, it actually can detract from.
Because part of what vitamin B12 does, besides giving energy, part of what it seems to do is it improves the ability of light to suppress your natural melatonin. And melatonin rises naturally at night and helps coordinate that sleep-wake system. It's not, melatonin itself isn't sedating in any way. I mean, so people take melatonin supplements as if they're a sedative. They're not. You give melatonin to a nocturnal animal, it wakes them up because melatonin is a nighttime signal. It's not a sleep signal. In humans, nighttime signals can be sleep signals. That's why melatonin doesn't work for insomnia either, because most people with insomnia, their body still knows it's nighttime and they still can't sleep. But light suppresses melatonin, which is part of the reason why screens are an issue. And B12 seems to help light suppress melatonin.
So correct me if I'm wrong, melatonin is like a circadian signal.
Yeah, it's a circadian
versus
signal.
A pure sleep signal.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most reliable circadian signals in the body, which is why we use it. We look at your natural melatonin rhythm to see where is that's how we can tell whether someone's biologically more of a night owl or a morning person. We see like where you're naturally producing melatonin. You don't start it till late. Well, you're naturally a late person because your body didn't realize it was nighttime. It put nighttime here versus nighttime here. So yeah, that's what melatonin is and what it does. That's why a lot of people will take it. And that's why also higher doses don't make you sleepier, but they will make you groggier the next day because, well, not only are they shifting, but you can't metabolize it that fast. So you just massively increase the area under the curve, and then you can only decrease it by a certain rate. And so by the morning, you've still got so much floating around in your system. You have a nighttime signal at the same time as you're getting daytime signals, and it can lead to that kind of grogginess.
I mean, while we're on the subject, what is like the minimally effective dose then? Like 5 milligrams?
No. A typical dose of melatonin is like half a milligram. Half a milligram or even a third of a milligram could totally fix the rhythms in a blind person who can't see light, so they can't naturally suppress their melatonin. That's all it takes.
It's funny because I buy the children's one, which is 1 milligram.
Right.
It's still more.
So a sleep person considers a normal dose a half to 3. And there seems to be almost no functional difference. So melatonin doesn't have a dose response effect either. It's not more, doesn't give you more. It's not because it's not a sedative that way. It's just a nighttime signal. It's just, are you saying nighttime in bold letters in all caps or in lowercase letters in smaller font? Either way, the message is received. And so it almost doesn't matter sometimes the dose, except in terms of what it's doing to the area under the curve. So slightly higher doses closer to bedtime, like 3 to 5 milligrams, might be better because you've already started naturally producing it and can sort of jumpstart the system a little bit more, which is why the 3 to 5 dose is more the sleep onset dose. Anything more than that is not going to give you any extra benefit unless you either are naturally melatonin deficient. So as people get older, they might produce less, but doesn't always happen. Or you're taking a medication like a beta blocker that could be suppressing your melatonin. So like as a hormone replacement, maybe a higher dose is better, but like that's an unusual situation. Under most situations, there's no real functional value from a sleep and circadian perspective for anything more than 3 to 5 milligrams, closer to like 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime, unless you're taking it for another reason. So melatonin is also a very potent antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. So the higher doses, actually 10 and above, can actually have neuroprotective. And there are other things that melatonin does.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I mean, that's why people who took melatonin got less COVID. They were using it as an adjunct treatment. Like it's actually a potent, it might be why melatonin evolved and why it's tied to nighttime. That's a whole other issue about how melatonin. So we consider the day-night cycle as a light-dark cycle. That's because we're visual animals. It's actually an energy cycle. It's a radiation cycle from the sun. We interpret the radiation from the sun as light, but much older organisms don't see.
Like a worm or something.
And so they saw it as an energy cycle. And so when the energy and radiation from the sun went down, that was when organisms could recover and repair that damage. And that might be where melatonin comes from. That's why you might see it. That's why you see it in plants and it's a much older molecule than animals. But melatonin seems to serve important recovery functions. Our bodies are way more complicated. We have much more complicated immune systems that do all kinds of stuff. So it's not as important to us as a recovery molecule, but it can be. So it does have these other functions, but that's a whole other rabbit hole.
Yeah, and it's when to take that is, I think that there's probably a very good use case for melatonin if you're traveling and you're going across systems.
Yeah, if you want to tell your body it's nighttime and it's not sure it's nighttime, melatonin's a great way to do that. It's like the opposite of light. If you want to tell your body it's daytime and it's not sure whether or not it's daytime, give yourself a bright light, like first thing in the morning. That's why light and melatonin do very little in the middle of the day, because your body knows it's daytime. Or in the middle of the night, it has very little effect because your body already knows it's nighttime. It's more those transitionary times.
Well, so first I want to point out that something really cool and interesting is that we're talking about the second order consequences, right? Like B12 impacts this melatonin system, which impacts your sleep overall. And I think that that's one of the really cool things about science is because we can study these things, and the athletes themselves, they don't have to necessarily get in the weeds and do this, but someone very smart is looking after this and saying, hey, this is a protocol.
And here's why. Here's why we don't say, you know what, if you have trouble sleeping, take melatonin. It's a nice natural sleep aid. Well, that's a lot of people say that and they end the conversation there. And then people are like, well, why are all these sleep people saying that it isn't? But it is, but it isn't. And it's complicated, but hopefully you can wrap your head around it a little better. Hopefully, like the athletes who are listening, they can understand, oh, okay, that's why. Because it's not necessarily sleep, it's a nighttime signal. Sometimes a nighttime signal is helpful, but if I'm not looking for a nighttime signal, that's why they're not recommending it for those situations.
Yeah, exactly. If my body, it knows it's night, it's not going to help me.
Right.
It's actually going to hurt me the next day if I'm groggy. I love that. And so this is actually, we're already talking about sleep cycles. I think it'd be really interesting for us to focus on the irregular sleep cycles of athletes. So we have travel, which is a big one for some athletes, not for others, but like an Olympic athlete right now is going out there to to Paris. If they're coming from the US, it's like 6-7 hour time difference, if I remember correctly. Probably a big change.
Yeah.
We also have disruption if they're in the Olympic Village. They're around a bunch of other athletes.
And when are they competing? Are they competing in the middle of their biological night? Are they competing at 3 a.m. in their body's time? Or are they competing at a good time?
Yeah. So I'm wondering how we navigate so many of these things. There's other factors too, like food and hydration, probably different there than what they're used to at home.
Yep.
And then we have, how do I actually sleep before that big game? Right. The really important thing. Can we maybe go down that list?
Okay.
And I mean, you don't have to remember all that.
Sure. The first thing I want to talk about is, what does a typical night of sleep look like under the hood? And we usually use sleep stages as a way to wrap our head around what this is. And when you look at a typical, say, perfect night of sleep, you have, so in terms of sleep stages, there's non-REM stages 1, 2, and 3, and then you have REM. Non-REM 1, so stage 1 is very light, transitionary stage. You should get as little of this. You should be getting very little. If you sort of nod off, that's sort of stage 1. It's very light sleep, but it is sleep. But people who have a lot of pain and discomfort will have a lot of stage 1 because it's kind of shallow sleep. But there should be very little of it. Stage 2 sometimes is called light sleep. Like a lot of trackers call what they call light sleep is because they can't tell the difference between 1 and 2, so they lump them together. But stage 2 isn't really light. It's kind of regular sleep. It's vanilla sleep. It's more than 50-60% of the night most of the time. This is when most of the work of sleep is happening, is in stage 2 sleep. Stage 3 is what a lot of people call deep sleep. It's also you'll see it called slow wave sleep because the brain waves are bigger and slower. But there's a big misunderstanding about why it's called deep sleep. It's called deep sleep because this is the sleep stage where you're discharging most of the sleep pressure you're building during the day. So by deep, you're harder to wake up from it. The thinking parts of your brain are kind of offline. And so when you wake up from it, you're really groggy and it takes a while to get back. It's sort of like pulling something up from the bottom of the pool versus the top of the pool. It requires a lot more effort and a lot more weight behind it. This is where a lot of healing and recovery happens. A lot of brain stuff is happening there too, but it's where you're very cut off. That doesn't mean it's deep for that reason. It's deep like the pool water is deep. Not that this is the only time your body is recovering. This is not the most important sleep stage. It's not I need to get more deep sleep. You don't need to get more. Your body will take as much as it can up to the point that it doesn't need it anymore. You can get in the way of it by having pain or other things that prevent you from going down deep, but it's not, you can have 0 deep sleep and recover totally fine. So it's unfortunate that it's used. Deep means multiple things. And when sleep scientists call it deep, they just mean it's hard to wake up from, not that it's the most recuperative or the only one that's recuperative. So then there's REM sleep, which is where most of the dreams and nightmares happen. You're actually actively paralyzed. Otherwise you'd be acting out your dreams. It's not deep. If you see anyone talking about that deep REM sleep, they have no clue what they're talking about. REM sleep is very light. It's actually more close to waking than most other stages of sleep in terms of brain activity. Blood flow in the brain is high during that time. A lot of stuff is happening in the brain during that time. The thing is, most of the stage 3, the deeper sleep, because that's when you're discharging most of your sleep pressure, the first 3 to 5 hours of the night is probably going to be mostly that stage of sleep, especially in younger people, especially people who have a lot of training during the day, need a lot of that recuperation. That's going to be in the first 3 to 5 hours. And then there's probably going to be little to none of it left because you'll discharge it all in the beginning of the night. The REM sleep mostly doesn't take over until the second half of the night. And what that means is people who are cutting their sleep short at 5 or 6 hours, you're actually not missing much of that stage 3 sleep. You're not missing much of that at all.
REM sleep
You're missing REM sleep. That's what you're cutting out. You're not cutting out the deep sleep. Like getting, extending your sleep from 6.5 to 7.5 hours doesn't give you any more of what you would call deep sleep, but it gives you more REM. And that's where the benefits are coming from of the longer sleep. So when we're talking about this, and what we're doing to the sleep cycles, what we're talking about is sort of modifying the schedule where that is, which is also why if you're taking a nap, you don't drop into deep sleep faster. The earlier you are in the day, the less sleep pressure you have built up. So at the end of the day, you have all your sleep pressure built up, you get into your deep sleep faster. That's why you can nap earlier in the day for 30, 60 minutes sometimes and don't get into deep sleep, which is good. You do not want to get into deep sleep when you're trying to take a relatively brief nap, because if you've ever napped and woken up feeling terrible, it's because you drop down into deep sleep and now you're coming up from the bottom of the pool instead of the top of the pool.
Yeah, I am guilty.
That's why actually sometimes that the answer to that is you shorten the nap because you want to wake up before that. The alternative is, so that's what I call, that's a power nap. That's how I would define a power nap. It's a nap that you wake up from before you drop into deep sleep. The earlier in the day, the longer you can make it, because that drop is going to take longer because you don't have enough sleep pressure built up to get into it, which is fine. And it improves recovery. It improves, even the power naps can improve mental and physical speed, reaction time, focus, all that stuff. You get benefits from it. The other kind of nap, I call it a sleep replacement nap, where it's kind of like a meal replacement shake, where no one's going to look at that and think that looks like a meal, but it sometimes does the trick in a pinch if you need calories and you need some nutrition. And so that's what I call it. And athletes do this a lot, and college students, where they take like the 3-hour nap during the day, where what you're doing is you have that delayed drop into deep sleep, then you drop into deep sleep, and then you come all the way out. And then you get into REM sleep and maybe wake up out of that first cycle. And instead of taking what's usually around 90 minutes, it took you closer to 2 to 3 hours to get through that. But you made it through a whole cycle with a big chunk of that deep sleep where you're getting that recovery. And so if you can't sleep at night, it's shift worker sleep. It's not quite as good as nighttime sleep, but it can do the trick in a pinch and it can be helpful. So that's why they're very different. One is you're getting the benefits of sleep without the deep sleep, but you're staying out of it. And so you don't have the same sort of sleep inertia and fatigue afterwards, or you actually budget enough time to make it all the way through a cycle. The third kind of nap is sort of the accidental nap. This is where you're falling asleep and you may not even know it, but you're taking sleep and it's impacting your ability to get sleep at night as well. And that's the sign that if you're falling asleep outside of your control, that's a sign that something's up.
That makes total sense. And so naps are one of these tools that athletes are doing to really regulate.
And
right?
and they're legit. I mean, the naps, it's sort of like, why simulate sleep with a stimulant by looking at recovery? I mean, you can stimulate away some of the reaction time stuff and some of the focus stuff, but all the data, especially the military data, show that you cannot caffeinate the prefrontal cortex. You can't caffeinate away the decision-making and thinking effects. You just are making bad decisions faster at that point, which is why there's this great study in semi-pro tennis players where sleep deprived, their serving accuracy reduced by, I think, more than a third. Then they caffeinated them, and about a third of the impairment was fixed, but not all of it. And there are militaries that studies that show the same thing, that you can caffeinate away some of the fatigue and some of the motor stuff, but not the complex cognitive stuff. That doesn't get fixed in the same way. You're still sleep deprived.
That makes sense. And it's interesting to me as we think about how athletes perform.
Yeah.
at peak performance, they're not thinking, right?
Right.
They're acting.
They're on automatic.
But automatic is a simple but also very complex process at the same time for it to function well.
Right.
So you have this, their logical reasoning and stuff might be impaired, but this automatic system, which is they've trained and is, some would say it's complex, some would say it's like a natural process. Yeah. That's also largely impaired as well. Right. It's interesting to think about that paradox.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the same thing. I mean, it's the same thing with like surgeons, also outliers. Surgeons, the data on surgeons, a lot of them are very sleep deprived. Sleep deprived surgeons can perform basic routine surgeries very well. They don't necessarily commit more errors. They don't like that you would expect. Unless something aberrant happens. So like if it's something that they can sort of do it in their sleep, they can do it in their sleep. If it's something that you're so well that you can even be sleep deprived and do it just fine because it's on automatic. But it's, what they find with the surgeons is it's all the other stuff. It's the decision making, it's the communication errors, it's the driving home afterwards. It's the when something is unusual or they get a curveball, can they react to it in the same way? And I think it's the same thing with athletes where there's plenty of sleep deprived athletes that are performing mostly just fine until something happens where they're not, and they don't, and that sort of happens.
I would argue it might even be, I can perform fine in practice.
Yeah.
Because there aren't as many variables. Like, I can go and practice and shoot a bunch of threes and be pretty close. But when the game comes and there's all these other variables and scenarios that aren't perfectly canned, things in theory, and I don't know if this is like explicitly researched, but I would imagine that's where it breaks down.
That would be my hypothesis as well. It's studied less in athletes, but in more operational situations like in the military and in medical settings, that's the kind of stuff you see. And that also explains, you're talking about, it's complicated. It's not so simple that like, if sleep is impacted, all of a sudden you're falling apart. If that were the case, our species would have died out a long time ago, right? I mean, sleep doesn't have to be perfect for you to be able to survive. It needed to be flexible and adaptable to danger and to stress. And of course it can. The question is, are you getting the sleep you need to barely function and not die? Or are you getting the amount of and quality of sleep you need to be optimal function? And between those two extremes, where are you? Are you closer to the, I'm getting by? Or are you closer to the, there's no way I could even get better?
And I would imagine almost everyone listening to this podcast wants to be closer to that optimal side.
Right. And that's why people are like, well, I'm doing fine. Well, where in the spectrum are you versus where you think you are? A great way to test it is actually get some better sleep and see what that does. But that's a different issue. But you were talking about some other things too. Yeah.
Well, so let's stay on naps just a little bit. I mean, something I've noticed is, we talked a little bit about this offline, I've talked about this at length on the podcast, is that, Kobe Bryant is famous for getting 4 or 5 hours a night of sleep, waking up early, doing 4 a.m. practices, going through all these things. But what nobody talks about is how often he's napping. He's a prolific napper. He's getting a lot of these rest hours in when everyone just is focusing on the fact that he's not sleeping. And then later in his career, he also was saying that basically he was sleep deprived. And when he realized that actually helped his performance improvement, so he could play into his 40s effectively.
I mean, like, so a couple of things to say about that. First of all, who knows how much better he could have been?
Yeah, or less injuries he might have had, or wear and tear. And
who knows? Sorts of things. Who knows? It's unknowable. But I mean, there's lots of examples of this, of famous high-performing people who are sleeping much less than what's recommended and still doing great things. You see this in the business world a lot too, where you have CEOs talking about how little sleep they get, or tweeting at 3 a.m. or whatever, and all this stuff, and talking about how, I'm so much more productive. Truth is, it's probably not true. First of all, they're probably getting more sleep than they realize. This is the difference between subjective and objective sleep as well, where they may be dozing off at times they don't know. They may be napping on purpose at other times too, and that counts as sleep. It's not just rest, it's also sleep. There's a difference between, in my world, we differentiate sleep and rest. Sleep, you're actually unconscious, and the brain and body are doing different things. You can rest. Rest is good too. Rest is critically important, but it's not sleep, and it's different. but they might be getting more sleep than they realize, but also they might be more impaired than they realize. There are many famous examples of high-powered people making bad decisions in the middle of the night or the day after they spent a lot of the middle of the night awake. And it might be attributable to other things going on, but I wonder if some of these things would not have happened, if some of these bad calls would not have been made with a brain and with eyes that actually were in closer to their optimal level of functioning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see it with the draft. You see it with a lot of sports teams. I know from personal experience from seeing how these things operate, everyone's up for a week straight.
Yeah.
And they're just working constantly. And that's a very important decision.
Well, so that's another thing I want to mention too. So a lot of times with athletes, they talk about pre-competition insomnia. And I say, actually, there are two solutions to pre-competition insomnia. Number one is bank good sleep. Sleep is, if you're barely staying vertical and someone bumps into you, you're likely to fall over. But if you're firm, if you are well planted and someone bumps into you, you're not going to fall over. You're barely going to move. And so if you're coming from a place of strength where your body is well recovered, your brain is well recovered, it is optimally able to face all kinds of challenges. One of those challenges may be a couple of sleepless nights that it could face better, as opposed to you're barely hanging in there and then you get bumped and then you're going to decompensate even further. So one of the best solutions for pre-competition insomnia is focus on your sleep for the week or two before in preparation for what's going to be a disruption. But if you know there's going to be a disruption, prepare for it. The second thing to do for pre-competition insomnia is, especially assuming you've done the first part, is actually don't worry about it. Remember what I said before about the deficits due to sleep loss are cumulative, which means 1 or 2 nights actually impairs your performance much less than you think it does. That you're more likely to psych yourself out and worry about not performing will actually get in your way of performing more than the actual decrements are going to be, especially if you nap and make up for some of that. So actually what I say is bank good sleep, nap, and actually don't worry about it because the worry is actually going to get in your way more than anything else.
Well, we talked about this a little bit offline. And so both Michael Phelps and Tiger Woods, the night before competitions, they sleep unbelievably well.
That's great.
And the reason is because they look at the body of work that they've done and realize they've already set themselves up for success.
Yeah.
And so if you have that backlog and it does take some like maybe lying to yourself or like framing it in a specific way. But if you can do that, and if you also can add in that frame of, hey, if I don't sleep that good tonight, it won't matter because I've built up this backlog of sleep. I've put in all of this work, all this effort. In Tiger Woods' case, I'm leading this tournament going into the 4th round. I could not put myself in better position if I tried.
Right.
I'd be sleeping and nervous if I was 3 shots back because I know how much work I have to do. Tomorrow I can just go play and have fun. And if I play about how good I normally play, I'll win by 5 shots.
Right.
And I think that psychology of that relates to the sleep anxiety is a very interesting phenomenon that a lot of people get wrapped up in that the wrong way.
Yeah, they get so focused on the whole issue of sleep anxiety, where whatever caused your insomnia caused you to lose sleep, and then that loss of sleep led to some sort of daytime consequence, which then makes you afraid of losing more sleep, which creates activation that you take into bed with you, which makes you lose more sleep, which gives you more consequences, which makes you fear even greater and be better able to predict that you're not going to sleep well, and that's how you create chronic insomnia. And so that's why I would say actually the worry and the effort are actually backfiring for those people. I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole we could talk about insomnia, but the take home message is the best thing to do about it with a short-term sleep problem is remember that this is a self-correcting system. It's sort of like if you don't have appetite for a day, no one says, you know what, maybe I'm sick, maybe I'm whatever. I just am not hungry today.
No one's like, I'm never going to eat again.
No one's like, what if I starve to death? Or like, what if I don't eat enough and I'm going to be nutritionally deficient and my bones are going to become like, no, you'll be more hungry tomorrow. And the system, it's a self-correcting system. And if you let sleep, the thing is we've micromanaged our schedule so much that we don't allow sleep to be self-correcting in that way. But like anyone who has a pet knows that animals don't worry about sleep. Mammals shouldn't be worrying about sleep. The system corrects itself.
Our cat sleeps all the time.
Yeah, they sleep when they want to.
Yeah.
You know, it's just we limit when we're allowed to, and then we worry that in the opportunity we give us will not be sufficient. Maybe we need to be a little more flexible when it comes to naps and sleep schedules to allow the system to self-correct. But that's another issue.
Well, something we mentioned earlier is about how these athletes, the ones that don't sleep, they get a lot of recognition and they're like, oh, I did all this. There's also a survivorship bias associated with that. And I wanted to make sure
a lot of the athletes who didn't get good sleep didn't make it.
Yeah. And a lot of the athletes that do get great sleep just don't talk about it. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I had to dig so both Michael Phelps and Roger Federer, they were at minimum getting 8 hours of sleep a night. Based on the demands of Michael Phelps' body, he was doing a 2-hour nap every day. I don't want to beat this nap thing to death, but I'm interested in if there are also maybe performance improvements associated with napping, not just in terms of sleep deprivation, in terms of learning and in terms of cognition.
Yeah. There's a whole literature from the laboratory world outside of athletes that shows that when you take especially younger people napping by choice, so that's the key. It's that the nap has to be kind of by choice. It's not the dozing off. You'll see stuff in the news about how napping is associated with all these bad things. It's because most napping in our society is not by choice. It's because you can't stay awake. And that's usually a sign that sleep is bad, which is tied to other health stuff. But when you take an otherwise healthy person who has an otherwise healthy physiology and you give them a nap late in the morning or close to the middle of the day, it reduces fatigue, improves reaction time, improves cognitive function, improves learning and memory. It does all that stuff. There's actually a great study in athletes specifically where under sleep deprivation conditions, you had literally reduced strength. It was looking at strength. It was looking at bench press, leg press, this grip strength, all this stuff. But when they were given a sufficient nap in the middle of the day, which was less than the amount of sleep that they lost, it almost completely recovered that strength loss. So the nap itself, especially for younger, healthier people when it's by choice, can be profoundly effective. That's what I was saying, the difference between rest and sleep. Sleep actually does a lot different things than rest. And napping gives you sleep. You don't need to find workarounds to not sleep. That is actually, you're giving yourself the thing your body wanted.
Interesting. So related to that, there's some athletes like Khabib Nurmagomedov, right? He sleeps after he trains, and there's been this maybe like dogma in a lot of like animes and stuff like that, where if you sleep right after you train, or if you learn something right before you go to bed, it gets encoded more effectively or something along those lines.
I don't know if the timing is that sensitive. Again, if the timing were that sensitive, then, humans wouldn't have learned stuff. It's flexible, but you'd want to sleep after training, not right before. Though, working out in the morning is better than working out at night. I don't know. Like, I'm not an expert in some of that stuff. That seems a little overly complicated. It seems like there's stuff I don't understand about that. But I think there's some truth to, yes, you want to sleep after your training because that's when the recovery is going to happen. There's data from the napping literature that shows when presented with information and then napping versus presenting the information and not napping and being tested at the same time later that day, you'll actually do better. Then it gets complicated if you're testing them the next day because both groups got to sleep. And so did the nap help, or did the sleep do all the work anyway, even if you didn't nap? So this is also why when I have a student working with students, I say, if you're going to do an all-nighter, just don't do it the night before the exam. Do it a couple nights before the exam, but don't do it right before the exam because you're going to go in and draw blanks, not make connections, not think clearly, and make dumb mistakes. That's actually, so if you weren't looking for a sign that something's up with your sleep, look for dumb mistakes, dumb errors of omission. Like you miss something. Like, how did I miss that? that's a sign that someone's probably not able to focus in the way that your attention isn't going where it should be going. And the question is why. One of the answers might be because you're not getting the sleep you need.
Okay, so we just spent a lot of time talking about one of the most powerful tools you described, which was naps.
Yes.
I'm interested in if there are supplemental tools that people can take that can benefit them, or if there's some supplements beyond what we talked about with like glutamine and caffeine that could actually be detrimental.
Great question. In terms of supplements and sleep, there's a first thing that I want to say, which is what is the difference between a supplement and a medication? The difference in the definition has to do with what they're for and what kind of claims they can substantiate. Where a supplement supplements, it takes a normal healthy process and could potentially aid it. So for example, a medicine can help lower your blood pressure because that's a medical outcome. That's a disease-focused outcome. That's a problem to fix. A supplement shouldn't say will help lower your blood pressure. That would be what a medicine would do. A supplement could say supports healthy heart. It's taking something that's a normal part of functioning and supplements it and makes it better. If it's fixing a problem, that's a medicine. And a lot of supplement companies walk this line. And when you start learning how to spot the difference between one kind of claim and another kind of claim, you start learning which supplement companies are trustworthy and which ones are not. If a supplement, if the advertisement is suggesting that a supplement fixes a medical condition, that treats something that a doctor would say, hey, you have this, take this and it will get better. That's probably what should be a medication, and a supplement probably can't do whatever that claim is. If it's saying, hey, you're within the normal range, or maybe you have more minor issues, but you wouldn't be diagnosed with this condition, but here's something that can help support that. So it's like, if you're feeling a little blue, you might take a supplement might help you feel a little more up and have energy. If you have clinical depression, a supplement is probably not going to cure it. And that's an important distinction. And I'm sorry for dwelling on it a little bit, but it's kind of one of these health literacy things that the marketplace makes very muddy. And as soon as you see it through that lens, things make more sense. So supplements that are claiming to fix some of those things, you can assume they're not going to work, whatever claim that is, for two reasons. One, they're not legally allowed to make that claim anyway. And supplements aren't designed for that. And most of the time when supplements are tested, they don't have those effects anyway. When they do, they get marketed as drugs because you can write a patent and patent the compound as a drug. Even though if the compound exists, if it's not used as a drug to treat X, you can write that patent. That's what happened with omega-3s and blood pressure, where omega-3s couldn't claim to lower blood pressure as a supplement. But it turns out clinical trials showed it did help treat hypertension. So they're able to charge a lot more money for it as a drug. This happens a lot with supplements that cross the line into drug. Most of the time, that's the way it works. So as a general rule of thumb, if they're acting at that it's comparable to a medication, it's probably not. And that's sort of a rule of thumb with the sleep supplements. There's a whole bunch of sleep related supplements that say will help you sleep better. That's a claim that walks the line because sleep is a natural, normal function, and helping sleep better is not a medical claim. Treating insomnia, now that's a medical claim. Insomnia is a medical condition. There is no supplement on the market today that beats placebo for treating insomnia. None. Some supplements have sedating qualities and have sedating properties, like valerian. Valerian has natural compounds that can be somewhat sleep-inducing. Magnesium also could help support healthy sleep. Glycine, saffron extract. What are some of the ones with some of the better data to support them? There's a few.
And we mentioned melatonin before.
Yeah,
as well,
melatonin, and melatonin's a weird exception
yeah.
because since it can help, does have probably more data than anything else to show that it promotes sleep. And melatonin's a great example where there's a paradox where Melatonin is most helpful for sleep in people who have the fewest sleep problems. It supports healthy sleep, but if you have a sleep problem that's interfering with your natural ability to sleep, telling your body it's nighttime won't fix that problem. So the worse your sleep problem is, the less melatonin is likely to help you. Of course, there are exceptions, but that's the general rule of thumb. Same thing with a lot of supplements. A lot of supplements can help people sleep unless they have insomnia, in which case that's too high of a barrier to get over for a lot of these supplements. So some of these things are somewhat sedating and they are somewhat relaxing. Like L-theanine can be relaxing. Magnesium can be relaxing at night. Some of them might have some mild relaxing properties that usually don't be placebo. Things like passion flower. There is a little bit of data on lavender. There's some data on chamomile. All of these things, there's the way to think about sleep-related supplements is most of them are not nothing, but if you're using it to fix a problem that's actually bothering you, it's probably not going to do the trick. It might have a placebo effect for a while, but there's a very good chance it's not going to do the trick for you. Lots of things in nature are slightly sedating, but if a slight sedation is going to make the difference between good sleep and bad sleep for you, you don't really have that much of a problem.
So rather than supplementation,
Yeah.
generally behavioral type things are probably a more
I mean, we've
viable
got
approach.
decades of data that shows that if you actually want to sleep better, we actually know how to do that. And actually the behavioral strategies for fixing insomnia not only work, but they outperform every prescription medication that's ever been on the market, as good or better in every head-to-head comparison that's been done.
Sounds pretty good.
Just most people don't know about it. And if they do, they may not understand it totally. So what I want people to look into is it's called cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. It's not cognitive behavior therapy like it is for depression. There's a cognitive behavior therapy for depression, for anxiety, for PTSD. There's all kinds of them. The one for insomnia is extremely unique. You need very special training to know how to do it because the techniques are very specific to insomnia. The way it works, in a nutshell, is that, and I think we talked about this a little bit, that the way insomnia works is that anything can cause a short-term loss of sleep. Any kind of stress, pain, illness, anything. But what ends up happening is you start pairing trying to sleep with failing to sleep. Maybe there's some barrier and you couldn't sleep if you wanted to. Sleep wasn't something that was going to happen no matter how hard you tried. And no one got to sleep faster by trying harder anyway. So what happens is you reliably get into the situation where for a little while, sleep isn't coming no matter how badly you want it. The difference between short-term insomnia that resolves on its own within a couple of days or a couple of weeks and chronic insomnia is, for some people, that reliable pairing of trying to sleep and being unable to becomes predictable. Whether it's conscious or not, the bed becomes the place where sleep is not to be found reliably, which creates an anticipatory anxiety where you start expecting that the bed is going to be a place where sleep will be difficult.
So this is like Pavlov's dog, so
right?
Like
yeah, it's almost just a conditioned response, and then getting into bed creates activation. Because even if you weren't stressed at all, the bed becomes a stressful place. So then you get into bed, you become stressed. That stress becomes the very activation that keeps you from falling asleep, which then strengthens the prediction that being in bed makes sleep difficult. And so you have this vicious circle where you're stressed, you get into bed, you can't sleep. And you can't sleep, which makes you stressed, which then you bring that stress in with you to bed, and then you can't sleep, which then reinforces the stress and shows that the stress was correct. So that next time before you get into bed, you're going to get stressed about not sleep. And it creates this loop that just loops and loops and loops. What CBTI does, the whole focus of the treatment, it's not about what caused you to lose sleep. It's almost never about the initial cause. At this point, the initial cause is mostly irrelevant. It's The ball is rolling down the hill. I don't care if it was kicked, pushed, shoved. I don't care what the cause was. It's probably not why the ball is rolling now. It's inertia. And so what CBTI does is it's a reprogramming. And like you were exactly right that it has to do with really basic principles of learning theory. It's a lot more like physical therapy than psychotherapy. You're just reteaching the body something it should already know how to do. You were built to be able to sleep.
Interesting. And it's essentially like creating a new habit. Right?
Yeah, it's sort of creating a new habit, but it's doing it instead of it being, it's doing it by leveraging your body's natural sleep drive. So a lot of the techniques in CBTI have to do with artificially increasing your natural sleep drive or eliminating time in bed when you are physically unable to sleep anyway. So a basic principle from CBTI that anyone can use is the concept of stimulus control. What stimulus control means, you're taking control of the stimulus value of the bed. So you want a stimulus creates a response. You want the bed creates wakefulness and stress. What you want is you want the bed to create sleep. And so you can't, if you want the bed to equal sleep, you've lost control of the sleep side of that equation. So you gain control of the bed side and use that. So the way to do it is, for example, if you don't think sleep is going to be imminent, delay your bedtime as long as you want. Stay up as late as you want to stay up in the short term until you feel like sleep is possible. Doesn't have to be highly probable, just possible. Then go to bed. If you're not asleep within 10, 15 minutes or so, whatever's reasonable for you, get up, take a break. It's like sitting down to eat. If you don't have an appetite, don't sit there and stare at your food for an hour. Get up, eat later, and wait until sleep is potentially imminent again. Then try again. And then eventually you fall asleep. If you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep, get up. Get up until sleep might be waiting for you back in bed. But if it's not there, don't go looking for it. Again, nobody got to sleep faster by trying harder. Another great saying, this comes from a colleague of mine, Lindsay Shaw, who does a lot of work with sleep in athletes. And she puts this best, and I use it with patients all the time, reminding people that sleep isn't something you do. Sleep is something that happens when the situation allows for it. The situation could be, what time of day is it? Where's your mind? Where's your body? What's going on? And if there's an element of that situation that you can control that will allow sleep to happen, go right ahead, knock yourself out. Do a breathing exercise, get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, whatever it is, roll over, change your pillow, get new sheets, whatever it is you need to do to change the situation to make sleep happen. But a lot of the time, it's not under your control. So you have a flare-up. Mental, physical, emotional, something out of your control happened. Your snow globe got shaken up. And you're not going to be able to fall back asleep until that snow settles. And you cannot make it go faster. Just like with a snow globe. The only thing you can do is make it go slower by continuing to poke it. And that's why waiting is actually the most useful thing you can do. So if you lose sleep one night, rather than panic, what you do is nothing. And it will, and one of my former mentors, Michael Phelp, one of the things he says is, this is the hardest nothing you've ever done. The more effort you put in, the more it's going to backfire. The effort adds energy into the system instead of taking the energy out. So to practice good stimulus control, don't go into bed unless you're actually expecting to fall asleep soon. Don't stay in bed unless you're falling back asleep. Separate any wake time when sleep is not compatible with whatever the situation is. Make it incompatible with the bed as well. And maybe it just means going to a chair. It doesn't mean you have to sit in the dark and meditate for an hour. It doesn't mean you can't do anything. It doesn't mean that you have to go exercise or whatever. Fine, sit in a comfy chair, sit on the couch, do something else. And when you feel the urge to sleep, when you feel your head bob and you're like, you know what, I think I can go back to sleep now, then go back into bed. And if it's time, it'll be time. If it's not time, you get up again. And the more you can distill this, in the short term, it's harder because it's not about sleep tonight. You could be like, but I heard if you can't sleep, you get up, but then I sleep less tonight. So it's sort of like when you sit down to eat and you're not hungry, what do? You You eat less today. Does that mean you're going to have a nutritional deficiency forever? No, you'll be a little more hungry tomorrow. But maybe you still have that mental block and you're not going to have an appetite tomorrow. So you eat a little bit less than normal. And then by the third day, you'll be hungry enough where you'll probably eat. Eventually, the system will self-correct. So don't worry about tonight. You'll compensate. You'll be fine. Trying harder isn't going to help either. Might as well not. It's not about tonight. It's about laying the foundation for the future. And the reason why this is critically important is not only does this solve a lot of sleep issues on its own, just being really good at stimulus control, but it inoculates you against future issues because the bed becomes so reliably tied with sleep. I use this with athletes all the time, especially athletes who travel a lot, especially across multiple time zones. What I do with them is before they travel in the off season or whatever, we rigorously program in stimulus control to the point where whenever they get into bed, even if they are mentally active, the bed is now a sleep trigger, not a wake trigger. It's the opposite. They've gotten to where every time they get into bed, sleep becomes predictable. It's going to happen, probably. And so we have a good wind down routine. They get into bed, they knock out. They get into bed, they knock out. They wake up in the middle of the night. Maybe they get up and do something. They get back into bed, they knock out. Getting into bed is reliably paired with knocking out. So then what happens is, let's say they're sleeping in an unfamiliar place, in a weird hotel room. Maybe they're 5 time zones away and their body clock is like, I don't even know what to do right now. But then what happens is, for the period of time before they get into bed, the lights are low, they do their evening routine, and they get into bed, their head's on a pillow, they're under a blanket. Head's on a pillow, under blanket, laying down, it's dark, sleep is coming. And so even if you were mentally active or you were in the wrong time zone, it's easier to fall asleep because the bed now helped you fall asleep. So it inoculates you against future sleep problems too.
So if I had unlimited resources as a professional athlete, one of the best things I could probably do would be get a like couch next to my bed.
Yeah, or a chair
Yeah.
or something, some comfy something, and you don't even need to leave the room. It's better if you leave the room because then it really creates that separation. We're even getting into the bedroom. It's like sort of like, no offense to any of the dentists, but it's like, not only is it, you get in the dentist chair, nothing happened yet, and you're already responding. That's stimulus control. You have stimulus control to the dentist's office, just in the opposite direction, where you're in the chair, you're responding physically and mentally to an event that hasn't even happened yet. Just like you do, the bed becomes the dentist chair for some people. And it gets so reliably paired that you're in the waiting room and you're already responding to those stimuli in the chair of like getting anxious and stressed. And you're in the car on the way over, so it can even generalize to other places. A positive example is like the training room, where no matter how tired or hungry or cranky you are, once you start your workout, you can usually finish it because you don't do anything else there. It's reliably paired. Being there is reliably paired to going through your workout. Once you get there, that's most of the work. Getting through the door was the hardest part. Then you'll because there's so little chance for anything else happening there, it helps you get in the zone. You want the bed to help you get in the zone to sleep.
So how sacred should we make the bed in that sense? Because, there's other stuff that people do in their beds.
Sex is fine. That's usually not a problem.
Okay.
But like a lot of student athletes have this issue where if you're like in a dorm or an apartment or whatever, the bed's also your couch. It's also your office. It's also your place you socialize, and watch TV. It would be better to go somewhere else. If you can't, actually, there's a relatively simple twist on this where, so I've got a colleague, so Jay Ellis and in the UK and Sarah Nowakowski at Baylor, they did this study where they went into jail. So in the jail, you stay in bed. You at night, if you wake up and there's no getting out of bed to go to the couch. So what do? So what they did, which was brilliant, and it worked beautifully, was one part of the bed is your sleeping part. You have a different part of the bed that's your awake part. So you don't mix the two. So it's sort of like if you sit in the same chair in class every day, that's your learning chair. Then if you sitting in a different chair when you're taking the test, you start forgetting stuff because you don't have that sense memory. So you want to create, if you have to be in bed for certain things, you want to make the alternative bed be as different as possible and incompatible with sleep. So you're sitting up, like you're not under the blankets, your head's not on a pillow. You're preferably in a different part of the bed. If you usually sleep on the left side, be on the foot, or some of the bed, or sideways, or something where there's no mixed signals in terms of, is this a sleep bed opportunity or not?
I might start doing that where, obviously my girlfriend and I sleep on our own sides of the bed.
Yeah.
Maybe when we're reading or doing whatever, we'll switch sides.
Or rotate 90 degrees.
That's fun. I like that.
It's just something where the learning of the mix, because your brain's not an idiot. Because it's like, it knows that if you can fall asleep now, you could, but you want to make it so that a change needed to occur. So this is the thing that happens on the couch. A lot of people, they'll nod off on the couch, then get into bed and be wide awake. First of all, what happened was, by nodding off the couch, they reduced their sleep pressure. They said they just had a snack right before their meal, and now they're not hungry because they satiated that hunger. But also, the couch becomes the place that they learn to fall asleep in, because that becomes reliably paired with falling asleep. Eventually, they just drift off on the couch. The bed becomes the place that they have a hard time falling asleep in. And so being rigorous about stimulus control, the more rigorous you can be, the more it'll inoculate you against a lot of these issues that athletes have. Let's say you have to get up at 5 a.m. to get to the weight room because, or swimmers, they're in the pool at like 5:30 in the morning. But it goes against your biology. So you need to go to bed extra early. But you're a 19-year-old, and 5 o'clock in the morning to you is the same as 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to me. Waking up then would be miserable. I'd have to go to bed way too early to be able to wake up at that time. How do you do that? Get really good at stimulus control. Getting into bed early can help be a force against what's keeping you up. Yeah, it's a way to gain control over your ability to sleep.
I mean, we see stimulus control, I guess, now that I think about it, in athletes all the time. I mean, there's a guy, David Goggins, who's like notoriously like a hard ass and a runner and whatever it is. And he's like, I don't like doing this, but once I put my shoes on, I go. Right. I've just conditioned that, like, this is what happens after I do this. And that is a very interesting way of, I mean, we've talked a lot about how on the podcast, how athletes kind of program themselves. Yeah. And this is just one.
This is just putting some language to how that programming actually occurs. A lot of athletes are probably engaging in all kinds of stimulus control without even realizing that's what it's called. But what you're doing is you're training yourself to learn the associations you want and unlearn the associations you don't want.
I would argue that all of the greatest coaches understand stimulus control really well at an intuitive level, because they say, hey, when you put on a Team USA jersey, when you put on the uniform, when I put on my shirt, it means that I'm coming into this frame. And I actually talked with this guy, Todd Herman, who's, conversations around the alter ego factor. I guess it's based on the Batman effect, where kids step into a role.
Yes. Yeah.
And very similar, where it's like, hey, we've created this like persona to do that. But you can do the same thing where it's like an object or a situation.
And it's just applying these principles to sleep. It doesn't, I mean, you could apply it to anything. It just, with sleep, it works beautifully because sleep is trainable. Sleep is highly trainable because a lot of it happens outside. It's something you're built to be able to do. And it's mostly when people have trouble with sleep. It's like when a patient comes in and says, I'm having trouble breathing. Usually the problem isn't that they just suck at breathing, right? Like, they've been breathing their whole life, and so has everybody else. They were built to be able to breathe, but why can't they? What's in the way? So it's usually about identifying what is preventing your body from doing the thing it was naturally built to be able to do. And that's when people have trouble sleeping. It's not just because they suck at sleeping. It's because something is preventing their body from doing the thing it's been built to be able to do since day one. What's in the way? What's preventing you from being able to do that? And then let's figure out what that is and get around it.
I really like this idea that you can effectively train sleep. I think as athletes, they're used to training.
Sleep
all
is
these other
highly
things.
trainable.
Yeah. And the idea that, hey, this is something concrete that we can also train. You know, you talked about obstacles in the way of sleep.
Yeah.
And we talked about the stimulus control. I would imagine stimulus control controls for a lot of these other variables, right? If you're only using your bed to sleep, you're probably not using your phone in bed.
Yeah.
There's
So
devices.
the thing with devices, there's 3 problems that come from the devices. There's the light, the mental activation, and time displacement. So the light, this is something, it's been really cool to see this permeate in sort of the collective understanding. Like people are talking about light now in a way that 10 years ago no one was really understanding. That when light hits the eye, it travels across through the optic nerve to the brain. And the brain, before it even gets to the visual center, it hits the clock. And that light information gets read by your internal clock, which is guessing where it's a 24-hour-ish clock, and it uses the external light information to check itself. So, especially around the transitions of day to night. So in the middle of the day and it's noon, it's like you can go into a dark movie theater. If you're relatively well rested, you're not super sleepy, the lights go out in the movie theater, you're not going to pass out. And you can go out the next day and it won't disrupt your sleep the next night, because light alterations in the middle of the day don't matter that much. But you ever gone to a movie theater? It was bright out when you entered and it's dark when you leave, and it always throws you off kind of for a second because you didn't see that natural transition and your clock got a little confused because it lost sense of the passage of time. And so your eye and your brain is using external light information to judge time constantly. What that means is light in the morning, as soon as you start seeing light in the morning, your brain's like, there it is, daytime. And so it starts your day. That's also why if you wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning and it's way too early, but you turn on a bunch of bright lights, it helps wake you up faster. Because it's your brain's like, okay, I guess it's daytime now, let me get started. Because light also suppresses your melatonin, which is that nighttime signal. And that's why you don't want a lot of light in the evening. Because if your melatonin's starting to rise naturally, and then you get a bunch of bright light, it can suppress it and delay it and make it shift it till later. Now, not all light is equal. Most people have even started hearing about blue light. What that means is there's a certain frequency of light that hits the clock specifically. It's a bluish green color. So red and yellow light don't have it. So I get all the red and yellow light you want, firelight, candlelight, even some of those yellow incandescent bulbs, especially a lot of the ones in the hotel rooms, are great because they have very little blue-green in them. So they're not suppressing that melatonin. Bright overhead LEDs have a lot of blue in them. Screens tend to have a lot of blue in them. And the thing is, if you're holding a screen just inches away from your face, even though there's not as much light coming from that as, say, a light bulb, it's just all going straight into hitting your retina. And so the light can have some effect. But that's usually overblown. So you can use blue blocking glasses. Those work great, especially if they're orange tinted or red tinted. They tend to work the best. Or tint the screen, which works unless you have white overhead lights around you, in which just tinting the screen doesn't really affect the light hitting your retina so much. But anyway, so that's the light issue. The one that's probably the most important is the mental activation, where what you're doing isn't there to like relax you. It's usually there to get your attention and keep it and get you riled up. So this is not a time like we're going to be in election season. This is when people are going to be throwing all kinds of crazy stuff around and getting people all excited. And like, that's not a time for that to be helpful. Like, that is not a time to get riled up. If you're going to be on a screen, don't do something within the last hour of bed that's going to be something you have to now wind down from. If you're using it to help wind down, don't do something you have to then wind down from. You shouldn't have to stretch before your stretches, right? Defeats the purpose.
So that would be, for example, a phone game. That
would be
so
like
media.
for some people, the news is what gets them riled up. For some people, it's drolling enough that they can tune it out. If the thing is, you don't want it to be to the point where it's increasing your activation. You want it to be not necessarily boring, but you don't want it. Here's a good rule of thumb. If an alarm went off now and said, put it down, could you? If you're like, no, I can't, I need to keep going 5 more minutes. Like it's the wrong thing.
So I am so confused by my girlfriend. So at night, if she reads nonfiction,
Yeah.
she can't fall asleep because she's like thinking about it.
Yeah.
If she reads fiction, she can just turn it off. And I'm the complete opposite.
That's funny.
Where if I read nonfiction, it's not boring to me, but it's interesting and I can read it. But if I read nonfiction, I have
Right.
Yeah, I'm like, it's like, oh, that's so intense.
Yeah.
I'm sweating.
And everyone's a little bit different. For some people, reading is great. For some people, what they're reading, it depends. For some people, watching a show is great. For some people, watching a show means you're binging something and one episode becomes 5 and next thing you know, it's 3:00 in the morning. And where did the time go? I'm actually great with shows because what I tell myself is it will be there tomorrow. It doesn't care if I watch it or not. My life doesn't change in any measurable
Especially
way
in this world now.
by knowing the answer to this question. So stuff like that. I mean, whatever it is, that's your rule of thumb is if you had to put it down, would you resist? If so, it's too activating in that last half hour, whatever. The other thing is the time displacement. And that's because it's so distracting, you lose sense of the passage of time. The problem there, in my opinion, is if your body has given you signals that it's time to go to bed, that you're ready, and you ignore those signals, you've lost. And then you can say like, oh, I wish I got an extra 30, 45 minutes of sleep. And your body's like, dude, I told you 30 to 45 minutes ago, you were ready, but you just didn't pay attention because you were so distracted. So my solution for that is, if you're watching TV on the couch, and if it's within that time where you want to find out if your body's going to give you signals, watch leaning forward. Lean forward on the couch because that's when your head bobs. If it's back, you barely notice it. But if it's forward, you notice it a little more. That's your signal. You're done. You've stopped paying attention. You're done. Your body is telling you you're ready. If you're on a screen, so for people who say, I need to be on my screen to wind down, so like they're on screens in bed, what I say is fine. You need to be on your screen, stand next to your bed on your screen. You're in the bedroom. You've got all the cues you need, but stand. Because one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to say, man, I've been standing here for like 30 minutes. I feel like an idiot. I should go to the couch. What am I doing? Because your body wasn't ready. Or you're going to say, what am I doing? I want to lie down. Like, I don't want to keep standing. I'm tired. That's your cue. You're done. You put it down.
Very actual.
You don't need it anymore.
I like that.
It's how do you not lose sense of your body's signals where you're getting too distracted?
So I'm sure this has happened to a lot of people, but that is one of my times that I'm most frustrated with myself.
Yeah.
Is there's this threshold where you're tired, and then I go through it, and then I'm awake again.
Right.
And I'm like, I missed it.
Yeah.
I missed the window that my body.
So the good news is the degree to which those windows exist is actually much less than people experience them, where the actual window itself is you're talking about a very minor fluctuation that people often overinterpret and they exaggerate, where they're like, and it's actually the stress of perceiving the window that creates more arousal than the actual window fluctuation itself. And so it's usually an attribution thing where don't worry about the windows, what I would say. It's like, and if for some odd reason you hit, a peak in a natural rhythm of fluctuation in your body, it's going to come around again soon enough. Don't worry about it. It's one of these things that a lot of people talk about and they experience it, but they misattribute. It's sort of like one of my favorites of these misattributions. It's a similar one. It's not the same one. People saying like, oh, I'm really asleep at the couch. And then I get up and I go to bed. And that act of getting up and going to bed and brushing my teeth just woke me up so much that I couldn't fall back asleep. No, it didn't. Unless you were like on a treadmill, like exerting yourself to do it. That wasn't that much activation. What happened was now all of a sudden you started thinking about not sleeping. And maybe you nodded off on the couch a little bit without realizing it. Now you've satiated some of your sleep drive, so you need to wait a little longer or something. But getting up to walk to the bed is not so stimulating that it's going to make you not fall asleep. People will say, but I experienced that. And I'll say, your experience was completely valid, but it wasn't for the reason you thought it was. And It was usually that. And you usually have this conditioned arousal to the bed at that point, where you've trained yourself that the bed is the war zone. And then you've mentally like amped yourself up to go there. That was the activation that increased, not like you've now started exercising by getting up and walking up the stairs or something.
So we talked before about supplements.
Yeah.
I'm interested maybe on the other side of that. So we can probably do this quickly, but there's obviously stimulants like caffeine and nicotine. Yeah. And then there's like barbiturates like alcohol. What role I would imagine if you're a high level athlete, around bedtime, you want to be avoiding these. But
so the thing with nicotine, you should be avoiding in general because it's bad for you, but there's no upside to nicotine. But for caffeine, the thing about caffeine is for most people, it will interfere with sleep for 4 to 6 hours after ingesting. That will go more the more caffeine you have because it just takes longer to get out of your system. Some people, it's 10 to 12 hours. So, but the role of caffeine in the real world in terms of interfering with sleep is usually a little bit exaggerated, I think. There's a great way to figure out if caffeine is impairing your ability to sleep. Stop caffeine at noon for a week. Got to give it a few days because the system has to realign itself and there might be withdrawal effects or whatever. Give yourself, I'm not saying cut out all caffeine, just cut out all caffeine after noon. If nothing changes, that was probably not the issue. Same thing with exercising late at night. A lot of people say like, I can't work out at night because I was told that it interferes with sleep. It might. Again, there's a great way to find out if you're the kind of person who exercising late at night interferes with sleep. If you're having trouble sleeping and you're exercising late at night, don't do that for a week. See what happens. If all of a sudden your sleep problems go away, that was it. If they weren't, that wasn't it.
Well, can that also be like a conditioned response? Oh, can you condition that response away? I mean, for example, when I was in Hawaii, I was training jiu-jitsu and the only class they really had was at night.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, after 6 months, I started to be able to sleep.
Yeah.
But it's also maybe a little bit more of like adrenaline and stuff.
Well, right. That's for some people, like, you get worked up and then you need to come down. And so it's also the distance from bedtime. It's like, it's as long as you have a little bit of time, usually that works. But some of these things. So in terms of stimulants, the main issue is hidden stimulants like in glutamine that people don't think of as stimulants, or the delay being something that people don't anticipate because you don't feel the caffeine 6 hours later, but it's still there. And it might be doing just enough to keep you from feeling ready for sleep. And that I think is the issue. I mean, caffeine is, it's a complicated compound where people have been using it for thousands of years. Another thing people have been using for thousands of years is alcohol. It's probably the most used sleep drug in the world. It does help you fall asleep faster. But the thing that people don't realize about alcohol is the alcohol molecule itself. When it metabolizes, it essentially becomes a compounds that can be stimulated. That's why when people drink before going to sleep, they might fall asleep faster, but then their sleep is shallower, or they wake up and can't get back to sleep a few hours later because of that. 1 or 2 drinks is probably not going to create that effect. It's probably not enough for most. Some people are that sensitive. Some people are not. And again, another good way to tell if the couple of drinks you're having before going to bed is impacting your sleep, shift your alcohol use to a couple hours earlier because it goes through your system pretty quickly. And if your wake time during the night shifts by a couple hours because of that, or goes away entirely, then you knew what the culprit was. But for most people, a drink or 2 at night is really an issue. It's more when you're having 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, I've worked with some people who are self-medicating and drinking even a lot more than that on a daily basis, and then they can't sleep. They pass out, but then their sleep is low quality. That's the thing with alcohol. You fall asleep faster usually, but your sleep is worse.
Is there also like dose per body weight or something like that?
Yeah, same thing.
Alcohol.
Yeah, same thing with like a lot of these. It's like same thing with caffeine. Caffeine is also based on body weight in terms of its effects, and your genetics of how you metabolize it. People have different genetics and how they metabolize alcohol and caffeine and all these other molecules that are external.
I thought it was really interesting. I mean, LeBron spends there, he's publicized as spending $1 million a year on his body.
Yeah.
But he really enjoys a glass of wine most nights, whatever it might be. And I realized that him drinking a glass or two of wine is like me drinking a thimble of wine. Right. So it's all relative in terms of size and in terms of your body to adjust and digest. I mean, I don't think anyone is still saying that a glass of wine a night is good for you like they were 5 years ago, right?
It seems like it's complicated.
Yeah.
Like, just like, working out is a stress on your body that makes it stronger. Alcohol might be, a little bit of alcohol might be a toxin that helps in some, like, because of some of the other phytochemicals in the wine. I don't know. People used to be using red wine as being heart protective. Maybe the alcohol is worse than the protective factors of the phytochemicals. Is one glass of wine. Humans have been drinking alcohol for thousands of years. Like,
we probably wouldn't be here if it was
right. If it was that bad, but like, also the alcohol content and stuff was lower back in the day. And, I don't know. I'm not a big drinker. But I mean, if I have a glass of wine with dinner, I'm probably not gonna have too much more than that. And if I do, I'm not thinking about, this might disrupt my sleep.
Mm-hmm.
For something like that, unless you are someone for whom it does, and then you probably know. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is like the cannabinoids, because this is being used a lot, and really there's a huge difference between THC and CBD. There's other things out there that are like CBN and Delta 8, and they're mostly just variants on THC and CBD. THC is the drug. It does have an impact. Yeah, that's the drug that you can't just buy it as a supplement. CBD is more sold as a supplement. And remember what I said about drugs versus supplements. It applies here too. THC is a drug. It has potent effects in all kinds of ways. One of the ways is for a lot of people, it can help people fall asleep faster and stay asleep more during the night and improve perceived sleep quality. But it doesn't work for everybody, but B, it seems to happen only in the short term, where over time, those benefits, even when you keep taking it, the benefits sort of dissipate. You got sort of like a tolerance. It also seems to be a REM sleep suppressor. So even if you are sleeping, you're not getting good REM sleep, which, could be complicated, maybe good, maybe bad. Antidepressants also are potent REM suppressors. And the other issue with THC is when you stop taking it, you can get a really bad insomnia rebound that might take a couple of weeks to work out of your system. And a lot of people say, well, I use this to I still don't sleep great because by now the positive effects have worn off, but whenever I stop, it's really bad. So I have to do it to keep that away. And it's like, well, that's just a withdrawal symptom. That'll go away on its own, but people don't know. So that's the THC issue. For athletes, I think I said this before, that whatever you're using it for sleep, there's probably a better option because it's not a great long-term solution. And the other effects on your body are probably not good for athletic performance and injury prevention. The CBD is different. CBD does not beat placebo for anything sleep related. Despite what the ads say, it is not really recommended for sleep. Doesn't seem to do much on average. Sometimes it makes sleep better. Sometimes it makes sleep worse. For some people, it seems to be helpful. Again, it usually doesn't last long term. So whatever you're using it for sleep, there's probably something better that's probably out there. But that's why they're very different from each other. CBD might have more effects on anxiety, but it doesn't really add anything to your sleep on average. Some people swear by it. There seems to be variability, but it's super murky. It's not anything. I don't say don't do it, but if I have patients who say, I really want to try this, I'll say, fine, go ahead. I just won't have super high hopes for it.
Well, something that you've been kind of alluding to a lot is try this. And if it improves your sleep, great. If it doesn't improve your sleep, whatever it might be. And it could be something the case with like a cannabinoid where it's like, hey, for some people it works really well. Maybe it is the placebo effect. Some people it doesn't. Because, even though we have like a normal distribution across events, we can have individual pockets that have whatever.
Yeah, because we don't understand all of the biology. So there might be individual differences. The other thing about sleep is it is extremely susceptible to placebo effects. From a research standpoint, that's a big deal because how do you know if the thing you're testing is actually working? And that's why you always need placebo controls in sleep trials. But in a real world situation, if you're sleeping kind of crappy and you want to sleep better, take a placebo. Placebos still work.
So everyone listening, everything we're describing in this episode works.
Right. Like you could spin around 3 times and click your heels together before getting into bed every night. It will work to fix insomnia because anything works. Well, because actually, part of the reason why anything works for placebos is you have a lot more, because sleep is highly trainable, you have a lot of intrinsic control over your sleep that you may just have trouble tapping into. And the placebo just helps you tap into the control you already have that you just don't know how. The other thing is when you start noticing your sleep over time, what you notice is there's fluctuation. So people with insomnia will say, I sleep bad all the time. Then you ask them to track their sleep. Turns out they have 3 to 5 bad nights a week, but not 7. And then, but if you say, okay, you sleep bad every night, I want you to click your heels together 3 times before getting into bed every night and track it. And so say, okay, I did this every night and I tracked it and it look, 20% of the time I didn't have insomnia. 30% of the time I didn't even have any insomnia. So it worked. It worked great. It wasn't perfect, but it worked 30% of the time. And I'm not going to say athletes are very susceptible to superstitious behavior, but yeah, I mean, so a lot of people will swear by things that really what it was it just the holes of the Swiss cheese aligned, and this wasn't going to be a night that they were going to have a bad night. Or what's especially worse is you set that up because the first night is bad. Ugh, that was bad. The second night is bad. Oh, that's even worse. Then you're like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to click my heels together 3 times and you go to bed. Well, you were so exhausted because of those first 2 bad nights, you fell asleep really fast no matter what you did. But now you created this pairing of this association. So like there's a whole rabbit hole of learning. This is why stimulus control is so effective, because learning and behavioral programming in sleep is so powerful. You're just leveraging it. But yeah, that's why a lot of so there's a common saying in our field of people who treat insomnia. It's like, what works for insomnia? Everything works sometimes.
Interesting. I love that. Well, you were talking about diagnostics,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I was wondering if we could dive into some of the sleep tracking a little bit.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Yeah, cool. So what people should know about the sleep tracking is most devices have 2 different things that they're measuring. There might be other things too, but the heavy lifting is really being done by the same 2 signals in pretty much every device. That's movement and heart rate. Sleep-wake detection is over 90%, maybe over 95%, depending on the algorithm. It's almost entirely based just on movement. It's the movement signal. The other signals on the device might be helping a little bit, but all the heavy lifting for sleep-wake detection currently in every device I've looked at, and I've looked at most of all of them for the last 20 years, it's because movement-based sleep-wake detection was originally, the first paper to do that was 1972. This is old technology, well vetted. We've been using it in research since the early 1980s. And I say we, you don't want to know how old I was in the early 1980s, or especially the people who are probably watching, they maybe didn't exist. But that's how long using wrist-based movement to reliably predict sleep-wake patterns. Those algorithms, the first algorithm with something like over a 90% accuracy rate came in 1982. That's how old this technology is. It's well vetted.
So how did they evaluate the accuracy rate?
So they look at it relative to in-lab sleep studies with an EEG. That's the standard. And you should be asking yourself, yeah, but should that be the standard? Because it's probably the most accurate physiologically and biologically, but isn't sleeping overnight one night in a lab not really the same as sleeping at home? And if it can detect sleep in the lab, does it mean it's equally good at detecting sleep at home? And for a few decades, that was actually a big weakness. These days, there's some more studies which are doing home-based studies too, and it seems to be working just fine. But so that's the gold standard, not because it's gold, because that's not a perfect measurement either. Remember, I said all measures are indirect. Um, they're all indirect measures of sleep, but it's the best we've got. The most reliable to the sleep wake biology that we have. So that's usually the gold standard that's used. It's pretty typical for devices to be 85 to 90-ish% accurate. By accurate, that means minute to minute, what percent of minutes agree with each other, whether you were awake or asleep, which is fine. But 90% accuracy still means in an 8-hour window, it's wrong 48 of those minutes, which is almost an hour. So it's not perfect. And there's kind of a ceiling effect where we can't seem to get much better than something like 90-ish, low 90s% accuracy. But it is what it is. Especially day to day, you can look at overall patterns. So it's movement. So whether it's on a ring, whether it's on a wrist, whether it's in your mattress, there are these devices that you can put it next to your bed that will look at radar or RF. They're all converting things into a movement signal. How much are you moving? And then converting that movement signal through a fairly standard algorithm to determine minute to minute, are you awake or asleep? The reason why it's not perfect is because movement patterns are really closely related to sleep wake. And there's subtle movements in sleep that are different from wake, and these algorithms account for that. But it's never perfect. Where like in some stages of sleep, you move. And some people with insomnia can lay in bed awake, not moving for significant periods of time and still be awake. It doesn't measure consciousness. That's why these devices are always inherently imperfect. But it's almost all based on movement. And they're about 90% accurate. But it's pretty good. And so with all of these devices, the thing they're best at is saying on a minute-to-minute basis, are you probably awake or probably asleep? Assuming that your sleep was fairly normal. If you're like, man, I got injured and I was rolling around all night, and you look at the data from the tracker, what you'll see is a lot of moving around. It might show more wake than you really had because maybe you were asleep rolling around. Or maybe it was more inaccurate because it violated some of the assumptions of the algorithm. The algorithm assumes relatively normal sleep. When you let's say you have untreated sleep apnea, you'll say, oh my gosh, I was up all night, but I remember sleeping. It's like, yeah, because you had all these respiratory events where you kept moving. So that's the grain of salt that you look at it with. The thing that the trackers are best at was I awake or asleep at any given point during the night, with the caveat that if there was any reason that it was really unusual, weigh it through that lens. The second thing they look at is sleep stages. That is mostly done through a combination of the movement and heart rate. The data shows that neither one of them can do it alone. So if you just have movement and they're looking at light versus deep sleep, nonsense, don't believe it. If it's just heart rate and it's looking at light versus deep sleep, nonsense, don't believe it. You need both. All of the mathematical data show that you really kind of need both contribute to the algorithm. Neither one alone does the trick, but both of them will get you about 80 to 90% accurate in terms of sleep staging, which is, we're saying 75 to 85, depending on the device, depending on the night, depending on how clean your data are, all these sorts of things. It doesn't matter if it's a ring or a wrist or a pant. That either way, it's getting movement and heart rate data. It's going through the same amount. The accuracy between the devices is shockingly similar. They're mostly interchangeable. If you look at them, we did a study where we compared like Fitbit, Whoop, Aura, like a bunch of different devices. They were mostly interchangeable. If I switched the label on the figure, you wouldn't be able to tell which one I was talking about. They're mostly the same. No offense to anybody. I mean, in terms of the data I look at, which are sleep versus wake, and the sleep staging data, which is mostly just ballpark. I don't look at number of minutes of deep or it's more about what does it look like across the night. Anything else, the heart rate data across the night, I also like to look at, because you'll always see a spike in heart rate when there's an awakening. That helps the device detect whether you were awake or asleep. You should have heart rate that drops across the night and then rises when you wake up. If that pattern is not that, something's up. But besides those metrics, any other metrics of things like recovery or total score or like all those sorts of things, that's kind of like for educational purposes, but I actually mostly just ignore those.
Yeah, I mean, they're just a baseline that they're creating from whatever is.
Yeah, they're not. if I were being ungenerous, I'd call them total made up nonsense. They're mostly made up, kind of nonsense sometimes, but they're educated guesses. The people who work for these companies aren't all idiots. Like they're mostly educated people who are trying to simplify a lot of variables for people. And they're coming up with a strategy for doing it. Is it generally a ballpark of something that might be useful? Yeah. It's just, it doesn't give me anything I need because I can actually look at the numbers and see what I'm looking for. So like when you see the number, it's a rough guess. I wouldn't take it as any kind of gold standard. That's actually the least important number of everything that's coming in.
So we're looking at, what are you looking at in the, for example?
Yeah.
Like
So the first number I look at is total sleep time, with the caveat that total sleep time on a wearable will probably be about 30 to 60 minutes less than total sleep time relative to your own recollection, which is what's used for the guidelines. So if your watch says 5.5 hours, I'm not going to worry because that probably means it was over 6. And if I ask you how much you slept, you'll probably say 6 hours and 15 minutes or something like that, which is much less of a worry than 5 and change. It's just because the devices are picking up lots of little awakenings that you don't remember. In a lab, there's actually going to be more wake time. So the device actually doesn't even pick up all of the wake. It picks up maybe half of the wake episodes that a lab EEG study would, but a lot more than you remember. So those will add up. In general, in a generally healthy sleeper, it'll be, I think the average is like 40 minutes less than the person thought they slept. And that kind of deviation doesn't make me bat an eye. So when people say, oh, my device said I only got 6 hours, I know I need 7. No, not 7 on a watch, 7 by your recollection. If it felt like 7, you're probably fine. The watch probably caught awakenings that didn't matter to that outcome. So that's the first number I look at through that lens. Then what I look at is awakenings across the night. Were there any big awakenings? Where were they? How many? By big awakenings, I see anything that you would have remembered that's at least 3 minutes long, versus something that's even, that's taking up a big portion of the night from like an insomnia awakening. But like, were there lots of these little awakenings, or were they just the little tick marks of like a minute or two where I don't even care about those? They're there, they exist, but they probably don't matter. It's more about the ones, how many of the actual total awake, where you were totally awake that you probably remembered that you have, and where were those across the night? Were they more in the beginning of the night? Were they more in the end of the night? Did they seem to happen around all the stage transitions? Like what's going on with those? Then I look at the heart rate data. And I look to see what the dynamics were across the night. Did it sort of start at resting heart rate and then drop and then pick up again with a couple little spikes? Did it rise at any point for some reason? Did it start way too high? And even if it dropped, you spent most of the night over resting? Where were the spikes? Did they coincide with where the awakenings were? Things like that. But it's all about the overall pattern. I don't overinterpret any particular data point because I know everything has a margin of error. And I care more about the weekly pattern than any one in particular night. Because, it's like I wouldn't judge someone's entire diet based on one meal that they ate. I would have to look at a week's worth of meals to be like, okay, is your diet good or bad? Anyone can eat a salad once,
Exactly. Well, I really like that frame because it can probably do us more harm than good if we're just looking at each night in isolation.
And people tend to overinterpret the numbers. There's a confusion between precision and accuracy. They're very precise, but there's always a margin of error around them. And to me, I look at it as a very blurry picture where I can enhance the blurry picture, but that doesn't mean the detail I'm seeing is real. As long as I consider it a blurry picture every time and treat it as a blurry picture, where just because there's an aberration, do I trust it, or is it just a blur? When you stack a bunch of blurry pictures on top of each other, a pattern will emerge. It's that overall pattern. So as a sleep person, what I know is sleep is dynamic. It's a night to night process. One night in isolation doesn't tell me very much. But if I look overall at a week, yes, one night you got 5 hours, but one night was 5, the rest of them were 7. I'm not going to be worried. Yeah, this one, it looks like there was like no deep sleep on this night. Maybe the algorithm didn't pick it up where it was because it's picking up just fine on the other nights. Like, that's why I don't overinterpret one particular night.
So you must wear like 4 devices each night.
I actually wear nothing, right? I'm wearing nothing right now. Mostly, like, I've worn them all. I've played around with them all. When you're wearing 2, if anyone wants to see how blurry the picture really is, wear 2 devices, especially because the algorithms are going to be mostly the same. So they should be the same, but you'll see the error between the two, that they're not going to be exactly the same. And that's okay.
So for personal curiosity, is EEG, if they were to create a device that would measure like on your head during your sleep, would that be more accurate?
It might, and those devices exist and they're increasingly becoming more. So like there's a couple even commercially available now. Like Muse has one. There's a few.
I had a Muse device.
Yeah.
10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, they've even changed over time, and there's a few of them. Like Dream was around for a while, then they got bought. I don't know if they're going to be available in the same way in the future. There's a couple other devices. Some of them are more on the science side, like Cerebra and Sleep Profiler. But as the technology gets smaller and cheaper, it will become more and more easily available at a reasonable price point. And is it better? It's probably, it will look more like an in-lab EEG for sure, because you're comparing, instead of comparing apples and oranges, you're comparing lemons and oranges, where they're different, but at least they're both citrus fruits, so they'll taste similarly enough. But it depends on the question you're asking, because it'll probably be more reliable in terms of some of the sleep staging data to whatever degree that's useful. I don't know. I'm curious to see. I have a feeling that there might be more precision in there than just movement. I would be really interested to see the combinations of when sort of like the blind people in the room with the elephant, where like everyone has a slightly different view and no one sees the whole picture. I think as a scientist, I try and measure sleep from as many angles as I can all the time. And actually, I look for the discrepancies and like, where did they agree and where did they disagree? What can we learn about that in those spaces?
Yeah. I mean, it's all relevant to who is using it, just as we were talking about, is that, hey, I'm not going to go around and play sports with my EEG on.
Right. It'll probably slide off. But then also, like with the heart rate data for athletes, some of the heart rate data and autonomic data might be more relevant than brainwave data, for example, in terms of that kind of recovery. And there might be other signals in the body, like skin temperature and endogenous circadian rhythms that people are getting out of wearables, and galvanic skin response, and there's patches that can measure sweat and stuff that's in your sweat over time. Like there's so much we can do in terms of sensors. Like sleep is such a many-factored thing that we need to not hyper focus on one modality, because again, they're all indirect measures. They're all different blind guys in the room with the elephant, and they're all the more perspectives you have, the better. If you're only going to pick one, pick one, but no, it's a limited view.
I love it. I want to be sensitive of your time. So maybe we go rapid fire through some like my last 3 questions here. So the first one is focused on sleep and injury.
Yes.
Like not prevention, but injury mitigation, risk mitigation. The second is focusing on sleep and actual recovery from injury. And then the last, we'll talk about some dreams.
Okay. Yeah. So from the injury perspective, there's lots of reasons why people who don't sleep well are more likely to get injured. And we've seen this in the occupational health literature for decades, that people who work like manual labor jobs and factory jobs, if they're more sleep deprived, they're more likely to get injured, have workers' comp claims and all this stuff. This all applies to athletes too. And actually there's a great study it was led by a guy named Ben Potenziano, who now works, I think he's in MLB right now, but when he was a postdoc, he did this great study where they gave a simple sleepiness questionnaire to a bunch of Major League Baseball players, then followed them up about 1.5 years later just to see, like, okay, of all the guys who filled this out, who's still in the majors? And there was a dose response. For every point on the scale that they were sleepy a year and a half ago, it increased their likelihood they were no longer in the majors. Where to the point where of the people who were in the clinical range, where that if you showed up in clinic and you had this, we would call you excessive daytime sleepiness and might require some medical intervention. 75% of those were no longer in the majors anymore. And I'm like, wow, one simple 8-item questionnaire a year and a half ago was that predictive. I'm like, what else could we do? So we did a study where we asked a bunch of questionnaires to a bunch of Division I athletes over the summer before they started. And then we followed them up a year later to see like who got concussions. And what we found was how sleepy they were over the summer before they started the season and how much insomnia they said they had. Completely independently, separately, both predicted who was going to get a concussion better than what sport they played, prior concussion history, or gender. They all did, but actually the sleep items were better. What didn't predict it was sleep, how much sleep they got. That wasn't predictive. It was how it was impacting them. It was the degree of insomnia and daytime sleepiness. And when they were both entered into the model, they didn't cancel each other out. They were measuring different things, apparently. So
this might be not the best informed question, but how much of that variance in concussions would like that sleep, the two sleep buckets?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Evaluate? And I don't know off the top of my head how best to answer it. Essentially, the way we looked at it was, to what degree did the presence of each of these in the statistical model predict who was going to get a concussion and who wasn't? And the degree of statistical improvement on those variables was greater than the statistical improvement from the traditional concussion risk factors. And if you had a model with the traditional concussion risk factors and then you added both of these separately or combined, it actually added more to the model. But basically, it's not like it increases it by 50%. It's more like, having these on board, having a high level, it was something like having a high level of sleepiness or a high level of insomnia. Either one, if I remember correctly, essentially tripled the likelihood you were going to get a concussion relative to baseline. It didn't, but baseline levels were still relatively low. So it's like, triple of a low number can still be a low number. And that's the thing.
Is 3%.
Right. Yeah. That's the thing about relative risk that a lot of people don't really understand. Just because you have a high relative risk doesn't mean you have a high absolute risk. But still, it was higher than something like some of the more traditional concussion risk factors that we already look out for. So my pitch is, well, maybe we should look out for it. So the question is why? Is it just a marker of someone who's at risk? Could it be just like the people who aren't sleeping well are just more stressed? And stressed people are more likely to make mistakes. Is it that, or is it the sleepiness is a marker of cognitive impairment, where if you're feeling sleepy, whether or not it's about your sleep at night, it could be about your inability to focus, and it could be a fatigue measure. And actually it's more the fact that you're having trouble focusing and then you're more likely to make an error or a mistake or something, or like, who knows? It's hard to know. It's just that there's a lot of reasons why poor sleep health could lead to more injury risk through things like miscoordination, decision-making. Remember, all the things that sleep impacts, things like immune system functioning. Maybe, you twist something, it heals faster when you're able to rest and recover better. Or maybe you become more resilient. Or maybe pain sensitivity is decreased, so pain feels worse when you're not sleeping more. Or it could be something like, you make a bad call or you have a lapse in your attention, an attentional lapse, and something hits you and you didn't see it coming. Like for all those reasons, it could. And then, but then also having an injury increases likelihood of sleep problems because of pain, because of all that other stuff.
I'd be very interested to look at that just specifically in soccer players.
Yeah.
Because it's like relatively, headers, lower contact than like a football player, which is less acute. Yeah. That could be
that would be, hey, if you know someone who has the data, I'd be happy to go through the analysis. That's the thing with a lot of these studies is a lot of studies in athletics are either very small samples because it's like, okay, we found 7 guys on one team or 7 female swimmers or 22 female swimmers who were able to do that, because usually it's smaller groups. And so it's really hard to generalize. Or it's like large surveys that have very little precision. And that's where the fields start. That's where sleep health started. It's, and we're getting better. And I think now that sport is recognizing the importance, they're starting to incorporate some better measurements, which we can start with better observational studies, which can then help us get better trials.
So at the end of the day,
yeah,
it really doesn't matter.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. It really doesn't matter why these athletes are having lower instances of injury or they're around in their leagues more. What matters is that sleep is causal of less.
It seems to be. It's something that sleep is doing or something that sleep is tied to. What we don't have yet are, what would be great is, in an ideal world, what we'd have is a clinical trial. We would measure all of the athletes in Major League Baseball, for example, find all the ones who are sleepy, randomize one group to a sleep intervention to make them less sleepy, and another group, we put them in a control group, and we see if there's a statistical difference of who stays in the majors and who doesn't, who has better performance and who doesn't. That's scientifically, that's how you would answer that question. But that's never going to happen.
Hey, there's a higher probability you could do that in football because there is so much onus on concussion.
That's true. I mean, but that's the thing where you have to bring teams together and there's competitive advantage issues and and then there's like different team culture and players association. Like, it's complicated, but like as a scientist, the way you would answer the questions, that's how you'd answer the question. Why don't we have the answer yet? Because no one's been able to pull that study off yet. Not because no one's been able to figure out how to ask the question. It's because the logistics of answering the question, we haven't quite figured out how to go there. And so that's the thing where we can apply all these scientific principles to sport. It's just, even though people are outliers, you randomize, but the logistics of it still haven't been solved yet. And we're maybe 10 years ago, we were nowhere close. Now we're kind of close. 10 years from now, we may look back and say, man, it's so great we did that study. I mean, the NCAA did this great work with the DOD and football in terms of concussion work. There's huge amounts of great opportunity to do some of these studies, especially if we can show that they're really for the good of everybody and there's really no major downside of participating. If we can figure out a way where there's no downside of participating and show that it is really helpful, I think we can get some buy-in.
Well, there's such important downstream effects, in my opinion, because it's not just the professional athletes you're looking at. You can extrapolate to pretty much every kid playing youth sports.
And I think that's an excellent point before we talk about dreams, to sort of wrap up the sort of performance-y stuff, is athletes are people. And everything that applies to athletes applies to everyone else. And I think that there's so much we can learn from athletes. There's so many things athletes can learn about how to improve their performance and improve what they're doing. But there's a lot that everyone can learn from athletes in terms of, here's somebody for whom some of the normal problems and confounders in the variables that we have in our models aren't there. And yet still they have these problems. They still have, there's still we're finally dealing with the mental health issues in sport. We finally come to this point culturally where we're like, you know what? It's fine to admit that this is real, that it exists, and it's worth doing something about. Sleep plays a role. The International Olympic Committee, for the first time, put out a consensus statement around mental health. They said their first thing about it. It was a couple of years ago, before the Tokyo Olympics, and I was part of that writing group. And it helped. And the NCAA before actually led the charge, with Brian Hainline at the NCAA really leading the charge to talk about mental health and bringing sleep into that conversation. And that was sort of how it got in, and I'm grateful for it. And I think, the conversations around sport are changing, and the degree to which athletes are allowed to also be people is I think really valuable, not just for the athletes themselves, but for everybody else.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I mean, one of the things that Michael Phelps was a huge advocate for was exactly this. He worked really hard on the film The Weight of Gold, where they talk directly about these mental health challenges. And I think that that's something that, if we can study people who are generally in like dramatically more confined and stressful situations, that can extrapolate so much further. I mean, to add to that, I would be very interested in the side of recovery. So sleep can be a powerful thing for not just like mental health and recovery.
It's a key element to recovery. There's a reason why, when someone's recovering, it's saying get some rest. Your body needs sleep to recover. You need enough sleep to recover. And if you're injured, you want to make sure you're getting as much sleep as your body wants. What that doesn't mean is lay in bed all day watching TV. That's bad stimulus control. Maybe sit up, move to a couch when you're resting and not sleeping, but maybe get extra sleep when you're recovering.
I want to re-emphasize the difference between rest and sleep.
Yes.
I think that's a really, really important thing.
They're both important.
Yeah.
They're both important. Sleep isn't just rest though. Sleep is a very active process with all kinds of other stuff going on that cannot happen when you're conscious, even if you're very rested.
And where you rest shouldn't necessarily be where you sleep.
Exactly. Great point.
Amazing. And so really, the last thing I want to focus on is this idea of dreams and what their role is. So there's a really interesting story about Michael Phelps before as he was approaching the Beijing Olympics. And he kept having this dream about 307. And he has no clue what 307 means. He goes to his coach, Bob, and he says, hey, that's probably a split time for the 400 IM. And so if he were to hit that split time, he would break the world record by a couple seconds. It'd be prolific. He eventually does hit the split time almost exactly at 307. He goes on to win and set the world record, Olympic record, all this stuff in the 400 IM. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into that. There's probably a lot of forces that we don't know. He doesn't know. Yeah. But it's interesting to see how vivid he's seeing this record and also how he's giving meaning to it in some sense after seeing it a bunch.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So dreams are amazing. I mean, dreams are the degree to which we've sort of scienceized sleep. Sometimes we kind of forget about dreams, not because they're not fascinating and important, but because we're not quite there yet in terms of the technology to leverage them. But we've actually come a really long way with understanding dreams. There's actually
a long way from like Freud. So.
Yeah. I mean, Freud was the first one to say, hey, this dream stuff, there's something here that's important. What it was, he didn't really know yet, but he knew that he's the one who noticed there was a connection between what was happening in dreams and what's happening when you're awake. That like you're the same person, just at a different side of you. But he didn't really understand he didn't know the physiology and he didn't know the neurochemistry behind it that we know now. There's actually a lot that we know. And in a nutshell, what dreams are you are experiencing the non-experiential event of your brain rewiring itself. You're witnessing the brain doing its own maintenance on itself. That's why it doesn't make sense because it's the brain speaking to itself in its native language of ideas and thoughts and metaphor. It's not wasting time with words and things that help individuals communicate to each other. It's communicating to itself with ideas and thoughts and connections. And dreams seem to serve some really important functions because when we take information all day, we're taking in information from the world and putting things out there. And dreams seem to be our body's way of taking the experiences that we had during the day and getting lessons and meaning from them that is kind of between the lines. Dreams do their work whether you remember them or not. Because you have them irrespective, you only remember them when you wake up from them. You still had them and they still did their job. So it's really good to know that whatever it is they're doing, whatever it is they help teach us about our experience, whatever they help integrate, you don't have to remember them for them to work.
Interesting. And I think maybe the broader lesson for athletes here is that your dreams can be meaningful. They can provide something constructive or productive for you. It does matter on how you interpret them, and you should probably always try to interpret them as in as most positive light as possible.
Yeah, I mean, they're not there to cause you harm. It's your mind and your brain's way of helping to make sense of the world. And sometimes people overly interpret negative elements in them. This is just your brain speaking in its native language of metaphor. So it's like, if you have a dream that you're in a car and the brakes are failing and you're going over a cliff and you're going to explode and die, that would be really bad if it happened in real life. In a dream, it's not that big of a deal. It's a metaphor. I feel like this is kind of off the rails, like that's not a terrible feeling to have. It just means like I need to get some stuff under control and I need to be a little more disciplined. But like if that were happening in real life, that would be really bad. So that's why, like, don't overinterpret, because sometimes people have negative imagery in dreams because that's what your brain came up with as a metaphor. But it could be an exaggerated version of the feeling, and that's okay. So I wouldn't stress. There's nothing in dreams that you need to really stress about. They can't cause you physical harm. It's your brain working through stuff, figuring stuff out, testing boundaries, building and testing connections. And it's doing its job whether you pay attention to it or not. You might be able to get insights from waking up from them. The only thing is, if you wake up, if you cut your sleep too short to 5 or 6 hours, you're missing out on a lot of dreams.
Well, there's one thing I wanted to emphasize in that is that the metaphor side of things. I mean, something that I see in coaches and in athletes constantly is they're very receptive to metaphors.
Yeah.
And to me, the connection here is that our brains are used to working in metaphors.
Yes.
That's how they convey information from maybe like conscious to unconscious or
Yes.
something along those lines. And that's a very powerful tool, whether you're trying to convince yourself to do something or whether you're a coach and you're trying to articulate something to another person. Metaphor is a very, very powerful tool. And it sounds all, fuzzy and sort of, non-scientific, but it is
right.
Very
That's
powerful.
how your brain understands things. It's sort of like, your brain doesn't, if it's experiencing something, it's not going to say it has feelings of lack of control mixed with a sense of something you kind of feel like you should control, and that with some effort you might be able to control, but there are elements that are out of, like, there's this whole words to describe it. Or your brain could be like, it's like your brakes are failing on your car. It's like that feeling. Imagine that feeling. That's kind of what it's like. Just kind of a toned down version of that. That's a much simpler way. That's a much more efficient way for the brain to communicate to itself than with like a string of words that can be interpreted or misinterpreted. That's why it speaks in metaphor, because it's an extremely efficient way for the brain to, it's just talking to itself. It doesn't have to translate.
And that description, just saying it, I know how I would feel.
Right.
Immediately without having to articulate how I would feel.
And that's why dreams work in metaphor, because that's how the brain works. It works in thought and idea and connection and metaphor, and it doesn't need to translate because it's only talking to itself.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it might talk a little too intelligently to itself. What does that mean? But I guess it doesn't matter.
It's talking to itself unconsciously. Your conscious mind starts superimposing rules onto it and value judgments. And, ooh, I shouldn't be thinking about that. Or like, ooh, that was bad. I shouldn't have done that. And you start putting waking judgments on things that don't have rules. And that's why the dream is a safe space. Like, anything can happen and it's okay. You'll wake up from it and it was there to teach a lesson. It didn't care, what the components of the lesson were. It just chose the most efficient way to convey the message. Whether you liked the words it chose or not, whether your conscious mind understood all the nuances of it or whatever, or approved of that being the metaphor it would have proposed to use if it were conscious, that's all irrelevant. Your brain is sorting through stuff. It's coming up with ideas and building connections and testing feelings out, and playing things out and trying to reorganize itself. That's all.
Amazing. I really want to very briefly touch on sleep and mental health, but I'm going to have someone to talk specifically on mental health in Olympic athletes. So can we do like a speed run?
Let me talk a little bit about sleep and mental health. So first of all, the connection between sleep and mental health is probably the most reliable in medicine, the correlation between insomnia and depression, especially. That every aspect of depression and every aspect of anxiety, whether it's feelings of guilt or lack of emotion, lack of feeling pleasure in things versus psychomotor issues versus feeling out of control versus being overwhelmed versus trouble, any aspect you can find is related to sleep. And sleeping better will improve those things. Sleeping better improves resilience, it improves mental health. In people with depression and insomnia, You treat the depression, the insomnia usually stays. You treat the insomnia, the depression often gets at least measurably better, if not totally. Same thing with pretty much any other mental health condition because sleep is so tied into them. It's really important. Insomnia triples suicide risk. This has been shown over dozens of studies over dozens of years now that it's one of the most reliable predictors. And nightmares relatively equally, uncontrollable nightmares. And this is a big problem because suicide is the second leading cause of death in the US in all age groups between 10 and 34, I think. And it's still in the top 5 up to 54. If it were the second leading cause of death it's the second leading cause of death in adolescents and young adults. If this were an infectious disease, we'd be mobilizing for a cure and a vaccine for the second leading cause of death. We're not, because we don't talk about it, but it's really important. And lack of sleep plays into it for a number of reasons. One, it's a marker of some of the mental health issues, but changes in sleep predict risk better than changes in depression do, because it's tied into things like pain, things like problem solving, things like hopelessness. Sleep is an important part of mental health. Pretty much every mental health diagnosis comes with sleep problems. Treating the sleep problems can help treat some of the mental health conditions. So there's my speed run of sleep and mental health. Don't ignore it.
Yeah. I mean, and again, we're going to do a full focus on mental health. This is not to say that mental health is like something that should necessarily be sped run.
Right.
But I think the focus of this is sleep and performance, but this is such an important part.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's anything I can take away, it's probably that sleep is closest thing to a miracle drug. If it was
it's
a drug.
Foundational.
Yeah.
It's a foundation. Like the performance benefits from sleep rival performance benefits from stuff that you shouldn't be using if you're in sport. You know, it's one of the best performance enhancers there is. Sleep deprivation is one of the things that can interfere with performance. You know, that why would an athlete want to do that to themselves? And whether it's physical, mental, cognitive, immune, this is why it's foundational. That's why it touches on all these systems. It's part of how all the systems work.
And to add to that, it's one of the things that we have a lot of control over, especially not necessarily through supplements or therapeutics, through our behaviors, which is a very powerful
and
thing.
it doesn't and you can train, it's trainable. You can train it. And sometimes you need help. I mean, for people who are looking for help with sleep, there are people who do specifically work with athletes because it's somewhat of a unique situation. But if you're looking for a sleep specialist, if you're looking for someone to deal more with something like sleep apnea or narcolepsy or more on the medical side, you want to look for a sleep physician or a sleep MD. Someone went to medical school and has a specialty in sleep. The way to find one is you go to the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, is the professional organization. Sleepeducation.com has a searchable list of all the accredited centers with sleep physicians around the country. If your issue is more behavioral, if it's more insomnia, if you're more talking about sleep and performance and that kind of thing, you want to look for a behavioral sleep specialist, which is different. Those are usually psychologists or other mental health clinicians and professionals. Like me, I'm a psychologist, not a physician. So the way to find someone like me, who's more of a behavioral sleep person, there's an organization called the Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine, or behavioralsleep.org. And there's a directory there. There's also another one called cbti.directory. If you just search for that, it's hosted by the University of Pennsylvania. It also has a very complete list of people who do behavioral sleep stuff.
Amazing. I will put the links to all of those, the links to all the research we discussed, as well as your website, your Twitter, your Instagram. Are there any other ways people should learn about you to
I'm easy to find. I'm easily Googleable. If people have questions, I'm fine to reach out. And the reason I am is that I can't always promise to write back right away, but I will write back when I can. It's only because a lot of people don't have anyone else to ask. And so if I'm the one person you know how to reach out to ask a random sleep question, I'm not inundated enough yet where I can't say don't do that. Or I can refer you to somebody else.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Grandner, this was awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Exponential Athlete Podcast featuring Dr. Grandner.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd really greatly appreciate it if you'd share this with just one person who you think might be able to benefit from a better understanding of sleep and the benefits associated with that for athletes. I'll also say I'd really appreciate it if you leave a review for the show. Reviews are one of the best ways to get the word around this podcast out there and let people know that there are listeners and it's providing value to people as well. If there's anything I could improve about the podcast, if there's anything that you'd like me to look into or any athletes you'd like me to study, please let me know. You can connect with me through social media, whether that's on LinkedIn under just my name, Ken G, on Instagram with the Exponential Athlete handle, on Twitter, which is Athlete X Podcast, I believe, or any other platform that I'm available, even email. I believe that's available through the YouTube description. Please reach out there. I will link all of those socials in the description as well as the show notes. Again, thank you for tuning in, and let's continue to pursue excellence together.